If I sweep your barn, would you let us sleep there, sir? Mama's too weak to walk another mile." Those 13 words would shatter the silence of a man who'd sworn never to let anyone close again. What started as a desperate plea from a 6-year-old girl became the most unlikely love story the Kansas Plains had ever witnessed. Stay with me until the end of this journey, and comment below what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels across the world. The summer of 1878 arrived on the Kansas Plains like a punishment from an angry god. The sun beat down mercilessly on the endless expanse of golden grass, turning the earth into a furnace that seemed determined to break the spirit of anyone foolish enough to call this place home. Heat waves shimmered in the distance, creating mirages that promised water where there was none. Hope, where hope had long since dried up and blown away with the dust. Harlan Gage stood at the fence line of his property, hammer in hand, sweat soaking through his worn cotton shirt. At 34 years old, he looked older. The kind of older that comes not from years but from carrying weight no man should have to bear alone. His face was weathered and lean, carved by wind and grief into something harder than the fence posts he was mending. Dark hair, streaked prematurely with gray at the temples, fell across his forehead as he worked. His eyes, once a warm brown according to those who remembered him from before the war, had turned to something closer to stone. The Gage Ranch sat 5 miles outside the small town of Millbrook, Kansas, far enough that Harlan could pretend the world didn't exist, close enough that he couldn't quite escape it entirely. The property had belonged to his father, then briefly to both him and his younger brother Thomas, and now, for the past 6 years, to Harlan alone. The farmhouse was sturdy but showed signs of neglect, shutters that needed painting, a porch step that sagged in the middle, windows that hadn't seen a proper cleaning since before the war. The barn, however, remained in perfect condition. Harlan couldn't explain why he maintained it so meticulously while letting the house deteriorate, except that somehow the barn felt less personal, less like admitting he was building a life here. He'd been alone since 1872, when the telegram came informing him that Thomas had died of typhoid fever in a military hospital in Virginia. They'd both survived the war itself, 4 years of hell that had tested every definition of survival, only for disease to take Thomas during what was supposed to be peacetime. The injustice of it had broken something fundamental in Harlan. He'd returned to Kansas, to this land they were supposed to work together, and found he couldn't bear the sight of Thomas's empty room, couldn't stand the silence where his brother's laughter should have been. So Harlan had retreated into himself, into work and routine and carefully constructed walls. He spoke to people in town only when necessary, brief, transactional conversations at the general store or the feed supply. He attended no social gatherings, accepted no dinner invitations, and made it abundantly clear through both word and demeanor that he preferred his own company. The townspeople had eventually stopped trying. Some called him troubled, others called him rude. A few of the older women, the ones who remembered him as a laughing boy before the war, called him heartbroken. But mostly, people just called him the hermit of the Gage Ranch and left him alone. Which was exactly how Harlan wanted it. He raised the hammer, driving another nail into the fence post with more force than strictly necessary. The physical labor felt good, gave him something to focus on besides the thoughts that churned constantly in his mind. He'd been working since dawn, and the sun was now high overhead, turning the world into a blast furnace. Sweat dripped into his eyes, and he paused to wipe his face with his sleeve. That's when he heard it. At first he thought it might be the wind. The plains were full of strange sounds, especially in the heat of summer. But then it came again, clearer this time. A voice, small and uncertain, but definitely human. "Excuse me, sir?" Harlan turned, squinting against the sun. At first he saw nothing but the shimmer of heat waves on the dusty road that led to his property. Then his eyes adjusted and he made out 2 figures, one tall, one small, standing at the edge of his land as if afraid to step any closer. His first instinct was to turn back to his work, to ignore them the way he'd ignored every other traveler who'd passed this way. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the way they stood there, so still and uncertain. Maybe it was the fact that he could see, even from this distance, how thin they were, how exhausted. "Sir?" The small voice came again, and now Harlan could see it was coming from a child, a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, with tangled blonde hair and a dress that had once been blue, but was now faded almost to gray by sun and dust. Harlan set down his hammer and walked slowly toward the fence, stopping about 10 feet from where they stood. Up close, he could see them more clearly, and what he saw made something uncomfortable twist in his chest. The woman was young, probably not yet 30, with brown hair pulled back in a loose bun that was falling apart. Her dress was patched in several places, and her face was pale beneath the dust of travel, with a sheen of fever sweat on her forehead. She swayed slightly as she stood. One hand pressed against her side as if it hurt to breathe. The other hand was clasped tightly by the little girl, who looked up at Harlan with eyes too old and too worried for such a young face. "We don't mean to bother you," the woman said, her voice hoarse and weak. "We're just passing through, heading to—" She stopped, swaying more noticeably. The little girl gripped her hand tighter, alarm flashing across her small face. "Mama," the child whispered urgently. The woman steadied herself with visible effort. "We're heading west," she continued, "but we got separated from the wagon train yesterday, and we've been walking since—" Another pause as she struggled to breathe. "Since dawn." Harlan said nothing, his face expressionless. He'd seen travelers before, families heading west in search of better lives, men running from debts or the law, women fleeing situations they wouldn't speak about. The Kansas plains were a corridor for the desperate and the hopeful, and Harlan had long ago decided that their problems were not his to solve. He had enough of his own, but the little girl was looking at him with such desperate hope, and before he could stop himself, he was cataloging the details he wished he hadn't noticed: the woman's fever-bright eyes, the way she couldn't seem to stop shivering despite the brutal heat, the child's bare feet wrapped in strips of cloth that were stained with blood, the single canvas bag slung over the woman's shoulder that seemed to contain everything they owned in the world. "There's a town about 3 miles west," Harlan said, his voice rough from disuse. "They've got a doctor." "We tried the town," the little girl said quickly. "They said we had to keep moving, said they were full up with folks passing through." Harlan's jaw tightened. He knew exactly which town they meant. Knew, too, that "full up" was often code for "we don't want your kind here." Travelers without money were rarely welcome, especially a sick woman and a child with no man to vouch for them. "That's so," he said flatly. The woman's face flushed, whether from fever or shame, Harlan couldn't tell. "We're not beggars," she said, lifting her chin with what looked like the last of her pride. "We're willing to work for anything you might spare. Food, water, a place to rest for a few hours." She paused, then added quietly, "We won't trouble you beyond that." Harlan should have said no. Every instinct, every carefully maintained boundary told him to direct them back to the road, to wish them well, to close the door on this moment before it became something more complicated. He didn't help people anymore. It was simpler that way, safer. But before he could form the words of refusal, the little girl stepped forward. She couldn't have weighed more than 40 pounds, all skin and bones and enormous blue eyes that looked at him with something that wasn't quite pleading, more like a quiet, determined courage that seemed impossibly old for such a small person. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the tremor Harlan could see running through her thin frame, "if I sweep your barn, would you let us sleep there? Mama's too weak to walk another mile." The words hit Harlan like a physical blow. He actually took a step backward, as if he could put distance between himself and the simple, devastating honesty of that request. The little girl didn't break eye contact, didn't look away, didn't cry. She just stood there, waiting for his answer, her small hand still clasping her mother's, her shoulders squared as if ready to take on the weight of the entire world if that's what it took to save the only family she had left. Something cracked in Harlan's chest, something he'd thought was too calcified to break anymore. He saw, suddenly and against his will, another little girl from another time, his cousin Rachel, who'd been orphaned by the war and had come to live with them for one winter. She'd had that same look, that same impossible bravery in the face of circumstances no child should have to navigate. Rachel had died that spring, along with half the county, when scarlet fever swept through. Harlan hadn't thought about her in years, had trained himself not to. "Christ," he muttered, turning away and dragging a hand across his face. He stood there for a long moment, staring at nothing, fighting with himself. Every rational part of his mind was screaming at him to walk away, to maintain the boundaries he'd built so carefully, to protect himself from the inevitable pain that came from letting people get close. But he could still hear the little girl's voice. "Mama's too weak to walk another mile. Water's by the trough," he said finally, not looking at them. His voice came out harder than he intended, almost angry. "Around the side of the barn. Rest there if you need to." "Thank you," the woman whispered. "Thank you so much. Don't thank me," Harlan cut her off sharply. He still couldn't look at them. "It's water, not charity. Everyone's entitled to water." He heard the shuffle of their footsteps as they made their way toward the barn, heard the little girl's soft voice saying, "See, Mama? I told you someone would help." But Harlan was already walking back to his fence line, picking up his hammer, trying to convince himself that this was just a temporary thing, that they'd rest for an hour and be on their way, that by tomorrow he'd barely remember they'd been here. He worked for another hour, driving nails with mechanical precision, trying not to look toward the barn. But eventually, the sun grew too fierce even for his stubbornness, and he found himself walking back toward the house for water. The barn door was open, just a crack, and as he passed, he couldn't help but glance inside. They'd settled in a corner in the cleanest patch of hay. The woman, she'd said her name was Clara, he remembered now, was lying down, her eyes closed, breathing shallow and rapid. The little girl sat beside her, and Harlan watched as she carefully unwrapped the bloody cloth from her feet, wincing but making no sound. Then she reached into their small bag and pulled out what looked like the last heel of bread, perhaps 3 or 4 bites worth. She broke it carefully in half, tucked one piece back in the bag, and began eating the other with tiny, controlled bites, making it last. She was rationing. A 6-year-old child was rationing food because she knew they had nothing else. Harlan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He told himself he didn't care. It wasn't his problem. The world was full of hungry children and desperate mothers, and he couldn't save them all. He'd learned that lesson the hard way during the war, watching young soldiers die in his arms while he could do nothing but offer useless comfort. He forced himself to turn away, to walk into his house and close the door behind him. The house was dim and cool after the brutal sun outside, dust motes floating in the strips of light that filtered through gaps in the curtains. Harlan stood in his kitchen, a sparse room with a table, 2 chairs, and cooking implements that rarely got used for anything more elaborate than coffee and beans, and stared at nothing. He should go back out, should finish the fence, should do any of the 100 tasks that needed doing on a property this size. Instead, he found himself opening cupboards, pulling down a loaf of bread he'd bought in town 3 days ago, some dried meat, a jar of preserved peaches from last fall's harvest. Before he could question what he was doing, he'd arranged it all on a plate, filled a pitcher with water from the pump, grabbed 2 tin cups. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, but his hands kept moving. When he stepped back outside, the afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, turning the sky shades of gold and amber. He walked to the barn, his boots loud on the hard-packed earth, and knocked once on the doorframe. "It's me," he said gruffly. "Harlan Gage. I'm coming in." The little girl's head popped up immediately, eyes wide. She positioned herself between Harlan and her mother, protective despite her size. Up close, Harlan could see that her eyes were blue like cornflowers, her hair so blonde it was almost white in certain lights. A scattering of freckles crossed her nose, and there was a stubborn set to her jaw that reminded Harlan of Thomas. "I brought food," he said, setting the plate down on a relatively clean section of the barn floor. "And water." The girl stared at the plate as if it might be a mirage. "We can't pay you," she said quietly. "Didn't ask you to." "Mama says we shouldn't take charity." "It's not charity," Harlan said, echoing his earlier words. "You offered to sweep the barn. Consider this payment in advance." The little girl looked at him for a long moment, those 2 old eyes studying his face as if trying to determine whether he was trustworthy. Then, apparently satisfied with whatever she saw, she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Gage," she said with a formality that would have been charming under different circumstances. "My name is Annie Wells. That's my mama, Clara Wells." "Mrs. Wells," Harlan said, nodding toward the sleeping woman. "Just Clara," Annie corrected. "Papa died 2 years ago. Mama says we don't need to pretend anymore." There was a story there, Harlan knew. Probably a sad one, but he'd learned long ago not to ask questions he didn't want answered. Instead, he said, "Your mother needs to see a doctor." "We know," Annie said simply, "but doctors cost money, and we spent the last of ours on the wagon train passage." Then when Mama got sick, the wagon master said she couldn't continue with them, said it might be catching, and he couldn't risk the other passengers. Her small face tightened with an anger that should have been impossible at her age. "He left us on the road with 3 days' food and said we were only 2 days from Millbrook, but Mama kept getting sicker, and we had to stop a lot, and the food ran out yesterday." Harlan closed his eyes briefly. He'd met men like that wagon master, men who could justify any cruelty as long as it served the greater good. He'd been ordered to be one of those men during the war, and the memory still made him sick. "The town doctor," he started, then stopped. Dr. Morrison was a good man, but he charged for his services, and he didn't make house calls for free. And even if Harlan paid, which he absolutely was not going to do because that would mean getting involved, Clara looked like she needed care that went beyond a single visit. "Look," he said finally, "your mother can rest here tonight. Tomorrow, if she's strong enough to travel, I'll take you both into town in the wagon. Someone there can help you figure out your next step." It was more than he'd intended to offer. It was already too much. Annie's face lit up with a smile so bright and grateful that Harlan had to look away. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're the first person who's been kind to us in a long time." "Don't make more of it than it is," Harlan said roughly. "It's one night in a barn, nothing more." But even as he said it, he knew he was lying to himself. He left them then, retreating to his house as the sun set and the temperature finally began to drop. He made himself coffee, ate a cold dinner, tried to read a newspaper that was 3 weeks old, but his eyes kept drifting to the window that looked out toward the barn, where a faint glow suggested Annie had lit the lantern he kept there. Around 9 o'clock, he heard it, a sound so soft he almost missed it, but once he recognized it, he couldn't unhear it. Singing. A child's voice, slightly off-key but pure and sweet, singing a lullaby. Harlan stood at the window, coffee cup forgotten in his hand, and listened. The song was an old one, something his own mother used to sing. The melody drifted across the darkening yard, mixing with the chirp of crickets and the whisper of wind through grass. And Harlan realized, with a sensation that felt like falling, that he couldn't remember the last time he'd heard music in this place. Couldn't remember the last time his property had felt like anything other than a tomb for memories and a shelter for ghosts. The silence, he understood suddenly, hadn't been peace. It had been death. He set down his coffee cup, walked to his bedroom, and pulled a quilt from the chest at the foot of his bed. It had been his mother's, one of the few things he'd kept after she passed. He never used it, couldn't bear to somehow, but now he found himself walking back outside, crossing the yard to the barn. Annie was still singing when he pushed open the door, her voice growing quieter as the song reached its end. She sat beside Clara, who was shivering despite the warm night, her fever clearly worsening. "She's cold," Annie said as Harlan approached. She didn't look surprised to see him, as if she'd somehow expected he'd come back. Harlan knelt and spread the quilt over Clara, tucking it around her shoulders. Up close, he could see that her color was bad, her lips slightly blue. This wasn't just a simple fever, this was something serious. "Has she been coughing?" he asked. Annie nodded. "For weeks. Started on the wagon train. Gets worse every day." Pneumonia, maybe, or consumption. Either way, she needed medicine and care that a barn couldn't provide. Harlan stood looking down at them, the sick woman and the brave child, and felt the last of his resistance crumbling. "Tomorrow," he said, making a decision he'd probably regret, "I'll ride into town and bring back the doctor. Tonight, if her fever gets worse, you come get me. House is right there. Don't hesitate." "Why are you helping us?" Annie asked. It wasn't accusatory, just genuinely curious. Harlan didn't have a good answer. Didn't have any answer that made sense, even to himself. "Because someone should," he said finally, then more quietly, "because maybe if more people had, your mother wouldn't be lying in a stranger's barn right now." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Annie?" "Yes, sir?" "You did good, asking for help. That takes courage." The little girl's face flushed with pleasure at the compliment, and Harlan fled before he could say anything else that might deepen this connection he wasn't ready for. Back in his house, He lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and listening to the night sounds. Somewhere in the darkness, Annie was probably still awake too, keeping watch over her mother. And Clara was fighting a fever that might kill her before morning. Harlan told himself this was still temporary, that he'd help them get back on their feet, point them toward their next destination, and then return to his carefully constructed solitude. He told himself that opening his door for one night didn't mean tearing down the walls he'd built around his heart. He told himself a lot of things that night, and with the dawn would come the realization that every single one of them was a lie. Because the moment Annie Wells had looked at him with those brave, desperate eyes and asked if she could sweep his barn in exchange for shelter, something had shifted. A door that had been rusted shut had creaked open, just a crack. And morning light, Harlan would discover, has a way of revealing everything you've been trying to hide, even from yourself, especially from yourself. Dawn came too early and too bright, spilling through the gaps in Harlan's curtains like an accusation. He'd barely slept, drifting in and out of restless half-dreams where Thomas's face kept blending with Annie's, where his mother's voice sang lullabies that turned into warnings he couldn't quite make out. When he finally gave up on sleep and dragged himself out of bed, the first thought that crossed his mind was that he hoped they'd already left, packed up their small bag and disappeared down the road while it was still cool, sparing him the complication of whatever came next. But when he looked out the window toward the barn, he saw thin smoke rising from the outdoor fire pit he rarely used. Someone was awake. Someone was still there. Harlan dressed slowly, pulling on work pants and a clean shirt, taking his time with each button as if delay might somehow change the situation. When he finally stepped outside, the morning air was already warming, promising another brutal day. He walked toward the barn, his boots crunching on the hard earth, and stopped short when he saw what awaited him. The barn doors stood open wide, and morning light flooded the interior, revealing a transformation that made Harlan blink in confusion. The floor, which had been covered in scattered hay and dust, and the accumulated debris of months of neglect, was swept clean. His tools, which he'd left in their usual jumble on the workbench, were organized by size and type, each one wiped free of rust and grime. The saddles and tack that had been draped haphazardly over sawhorses were now properly hung on the wall pegs. Even the windows, grimy with years of accumulated dirt, showed signs of someone's careful attention, though the job was only half finished. And there, in the corner where he'd left them last night, sat Annie Wells on an overturned bucket, her small hands working a needle through the fabric of his work shirt, the one he'd torn on fence wire 2 weeks ago and had been meaning to mend but never quite got around to. She looked up when his shadow fell across the doorway, and something in her expression made Harlan's chest tight. There was pride there and determination, but also a bone-deep exhaustion that no child should carry. "Good morning, Mr. Gage," she said, her voice hoarse but polite. "I hope you don't mind. I wanted to earn our keep, like I promised." Harlan stepped inside, turning slowly to take in the extent of the work she'd done. It must have taken hours. She must have been up since before first light, working by lamplight, and then dawn's early glow, pushing her small body through exhaustion to make good on a promise she'd made in desperation. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Yes, I did," Annie replied simply. "You gave us food and shelter. Mama always says we pay our debts." She held up the shirt, examining her stitching with a critical eye. "I'm not as good at sewing as Mama, but I think it'll hold." Harlan crossed the barn and took the shirt from her small hands. The stitches were uneven but serviceable, each one placed with obvious care. He looked down at this child who'd worked through the night to repay a kindness that shouldn't have required repayment, and felt something shift dangerously in his chest. "Where's your mother?" he asked. Annie's face clouded. "Sleeping. She was coughing bad in the night, but it got better toward morning. I gave her some water, and she said her head hurt less." The girl's voice dropped to a whisper. "But she's still real hot, Mr. Gage. I'm scared." The admission seemed to cost her something. Harlan could see her fighting to maintain the brave facade she'd constructed, to be strong enough to carry the weight that had fallen on her 2 young shoulders. And in that moment, looking at this fierce, frightened little girl, Harlan made a decision that would change everything. "Get your things together," he said. "I'm taking your mother to see the doctor." Annie's eyes went wide. "But we can't pay us." I didn't ask if you could pay. I said I'm taking her to the doctor. Harlan's tone left no room for argument. Town's only an hour by wagon, and Dr. Morrison owes me a favor. This last part was a lie, but it rolled off his tongue easily enough. Let me see to my horse, and we'll go. He started to turn away, but Annie's small hand caught his sleeve. When he looked down, she was staring up at him with tears streaming down her face, the first tears he'd seen from her, the first crack in that impossible armor of courage. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Harlan felt something break inside him, something that had been holding firm for 6 years. He awkwardly patted her shoulder, then fled toward the house before she could see how much her gratitude undid him. Inside, he moved quickly, gathering supplies and trying not to think too hard about what he was doing. He filled a canteen with water, grabbed some bread and cheese for the journey, pulled his rarely used good jacket from the wardrobe. His hands were shaking slightly as he buttoned it, and he forced himself to breathe slowly, to maintain the control he'd cultivated so carefully. This was just being a decent human being, he told himself. This was just doing what any reasonable person would do when confronted with a sick woman and a desperate child. It didn't mean he was letting them in. It didn't mean he was opening himself up to the inevitable pain that came from caring. But even as he formed these thoughts, he knew they were lies. When he returned to the barn, Annie had gathered their few possessions and was kneeling beside Clara, speaking to her in low, urgent tones. Clara's eyes were open but glazed with fever, and she seemed to be having trouble focusing on her daughter's face. "Mama, Mr. Gage is taking us to the doctor," Annie was saying. "You're going to be all right. You hear me? You're going to be all right." Clara's lips moved, forming words too quiet for Harlan to hear. He hitched his horse to the wagon with practiced efficiency, then spread an old quilt in the wagon bed to provide some cushioning against the inevitable jostling of the rough road. "We need to get her into the wagon," he said. "Can she walk?" "I can manage," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. She tried to sit up, but the effort made her gasp with pain, one hand pressed against her ribs. "The hell you can," Harlan muttered. Without giving himself time to reconsider, he bent and slipped one arm under her knees, the other behind her back, and lifted. She weighed almost nothing, light as a child despite being a grown woman. The realization of how close to starvation they must have been made his jaw clench. Clara made a small sound of protest. "Please, you don't have to. This isn't proper." "Nothing proper about dying in a barn," Harlan said bluntly, carrying her to the wagon. "And nothing improper about accepting help when you need it." He settled her as gently as he could in the wagon bed, tucking the quilt around her. Annie scrambled up beside her mother, positioning herself so Clara's head could rest in her lap. The little girl's hand smoothed her mother's hair with a tenderness that made Harlan have to look away. The ride into Millbrook took longer than usual. Harlan kept the horse to a careful walk, trying to minimize the bumps and jolts that made Clara gasp with pain. The sun climbed higher, turning the world into a furnace, and Harlan found himself grateful he'd thought to bring water. Every 15 minutes or so, Annie would coax her mother into taking small sips, speaking encouragement in that steady voice that seemed impossible from someone so young. "That's good, Mama. Just a little more. We're almost there. Mr. Gage is going to make sure you're taken care of. Everything's going to be fine." Harlan wondered who Annie was trying to convince, her mother or herself. They were about halfway to town when Clara's fever-bright eyes fixed on Harlan's back. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice stronger than it had been. "You don't know us. We're nothing to you." Harlan didn't turn around, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. "Does there need to be a reason?" "In my experience, yes. Everyone wants something." There was no bitterness in her words, just a weary acceptance that made Harlan wonder what she'd been through, what series of disappointments had taught her that kindness always came with a price tag. "Maybe I just don't want your daughter's courage going to waste," he said finally. "She asked me for help. Seemed wrong to say no." He heard Clara's soft intake of breath, then silence. When he glanced back, her eyes were closed again, but there was something different in her face, a slight softening of the lines of pain and worry that had been etched so deeply there. Millbrook appeared on the horizon like a promise or a threat, depending on perspective. It was a small town, maybe 300 people if you counted generously, consisting of a main street with a handful of businesses, a church, a schoolhouse, and clusters of homes spreading out in rough approximation of organization. Harlan rarely came here anymore. Only when necessity demanded supplies he couldn't produce or repair himself. He drove straight to Dr. Morrison's house, which sat at the edge of town with a small painted sign out front advertising medical services. The doctor was in his 60s, a thin man with kind eyes and hands that trembled slightly with age but were still steady enough when it mattered. Harlan had always respected him, even if they'd never been particularly close. Morrison was in his garden when Harlan pulled up, tending to the medicinal herbs he grew to supplement his pharmaceutical supplies. He looked up at the sound of the wagon, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to concern as he registered the scene. "Harlan Gage," he said, setting down his trowel and wiping his hands on his apron. "Haven't seen you in town for months. What brings you—" He stopped as he got close enough to see Clara in the wagon bed. "Ah, I see. She's got fever and a bad cough," Harlan said without preamble. "Ribs hurt when she breathes. Been sick for weeks." Morrison climbed into the wagon bed with surprising agility for a man his age, his professional demeanor settling over him like a cloak. He pressed his hand to Clara's forehead, felt her pulse, listened to her breathing. His face grew more serious with each passing moment. "Pneumonia," he said finally. "Pretty advanced from the sound of it. She needs bed rest, fluids, and medication. Lots of all three." He looked at Harlan. "She needs nursing care, Gage, round the clock for at least a week, maybe 2. "Fine," Harlan said before he could stop himself. "I'll take her back to my place. You tell me what to do." Morrison's eyebrows rose. "You know these folks?" "Does it matter?" The doctor studied him for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "No, I suppose it doesn't. But Harlan, nursing pneumonia is serious work. It's not just giving someone water and hoping for the best. She'll need monitoring, medication administered on schedule, help with basic functions. Are you prepared for that?" Harlan thought about his quiet house, his careful routines, the solitude he'd cultivated so deliberately. He thought about how easily all of it could be disrupted by a sick woman and a watchful child. Every rational part of his brain screamed at him to find another solution, to pay for a room at the boarding house, to track down relatives who could take them in, to do anything except volunteer himself for weeks of intensive caretaking. But then Annie's small voice spoke up from the wagon bed. "I can help. I'm real good at following instructions and I can stay up all night if I need to. I won't be any trouble, I promise." And Harlan heard himself say, "We'll manage." Morrison looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. "All right then. Let me get my bag. I'll ride back with you, get her settled, and show you what needs doing." The return journey was slower still, with the doctor riding in the wagon bed beside Clara, monitoring her condition and occasionally administering small doses of medication from the bottles in his black bag. Harlan listened as Morrison explained the treatment plan: hourly fluids, medicine every 4 hours, poultices for the chest, careful monitoring for signs of worsening. It sounded overwhelming, but Annie absorbed every word with fierce concentration, asking clarifying questions that showed a maturity far beyond her years. "If her breathing gets worse, or if she starts coughing up blood, you send someone for me immediately," Morrison was saying. "Doesn't matter if it's the middle of the night. Pneumonia can turn bad quickly." "There's no one to send," Harlan said. "I live alone." Morrison frowned. "Then one of you will have to ride. Can the girl manage a horse?" "I can learn," Annie said immediately. "I'm a quick learner." "She's 6 years old," Harlan protested. "I'm almost 7, Annie corrected indignantly. "And I'm real good with animals. I took care of all the chickens and the goat back before—" She stopped abruptly, her face clouding. Before what? Harlan wondered. Before her father died? Before whatever circumstances had reduced them to wandering the Kansas plains with nothing but a canvas bag and each other? He didn't ask. He'd learned long ago that some stories were too painful to tell to strangers, even kind ones. When they reached the ranch, Harlan faced a decision he'd been avoiding: where to put them. The barn, even cleaned up, wasn't suitable for a woman who needed rest and monitoring, but bringing them into his house, into his private space, felt like crossing a line he'd sworn never to cross again. Morrison made the decision for him. "She needs to be somewhere clean, and temperature controlled, he said firmly. The barn won't do. You have a spare room in that house of yours? I have Thomas's room, Harlan said, and then wondered why he'd phrased it that way. It hadn't been Thomas's room for 6 years. It was just a room. Empty. Unused. Dead. Like everything else he touched. Then that's where she goes, Morrison said, his tone brooking no argument. So Harlan found himself carrying Clara Wells across the threshold of his house, through the dim parlor he never used, down the hallway to the room he'd kept closed for 6 years. Annie rushed ahead to open the door, and Harlan stepped into a space that smelled of dust and memory and time suspended. Thomas's few possessions were still there, his books on the shelf, his spare boots by the door, his jacket hanging on a peg as if waiting for him to return from some errand. Harlan had never been able to bring himself to clear them out, but neither could he bear to enter the room and see them. So it had remained, a shrine to a brother who wasn't coming back. Windows, Morrison said briskly, and Annie immediately set about opening them, letting fresh air and sunlight flood the space. And we'll need clean linens. Harlan, you have any? Harlan did, though they were stored in his mother's old cedar chest, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd used them. He retrieved them while Morrison directed Annie in turning down the bed and arranging pillows. When everything was ready, Harlan laid Clara gently on the mattress, and she sank into it with a sound that was half relief, half pain. For the next hour, Dr. Morrison worked with quiet efficiency, examining Clara more thoroughly, administering medication, showing Annie how to make the poultices that would help break up the congestion in her lungs. Harlan watched from the doorway, feeling like an intruder in his own home, until Morrison called him over. Pay attention, Gage. You're going to be doing this too. So Harlan learned how to measure laudanum without giving too much, how to position a patient to ease breathing, how to recognize the signs that someone was improving or deteriorating. His hands felt too large and clumsy for such delicate work. But Morrison was patient, demonstrating until Harlan had the movements down. She'll likely sleep a lot for the next few days, Morrison said when they were done. The laudanum will help with that, and rest is what she needs most. Keep her hydrated, keep her medicated on schedule, and watch for fever spikes. If her temperature goes too high, use cool cloths on her forehead and wrists. I can do that, Annie said immediately. She'd positioned herself in a chair beside the bed, one small hand resting on her mother's arm, as if to anchor her to the world. Morrison looked at her with something like admiration. I believe you can, young lady. But you need to rest too, understand? You can't help your mother if you collapse from exhaustion. I won't collapse, Annie said with absolute certainty. Morrison exchanged a glance with Harlan that said children, and then turned back to his patient. Clara's eyes fluttered open briefly, fighting through the fog of medication and fever. Annie, she whispered, come here, baby. The little girl leaned close, and Clara's hand found hers. You mind Mr. Gage, you hear? Don't be any trouble. We'll leave as soon as I'm better. We won't impose. Hush, Morrison said gently. No one's imposing on anyone. Right now, you just focus on getting well. Clara's eyes sought Harlan, standing in the shadows by the door. Thank you, she said, and there was something in her voice, not just gratitude but a kind of desperate hope, that made Harlan have to look away. I don't know why you're being so kind, but thank you. Sleep, Harlan said gruffly. We'll talk when you're better. Morrison packed up his supplies and motioned for Harlan to follow him outside. On the porch, with the door closed behind them, the doctor fixed Harlan with a penetrating stare. That woman is severely malnourished and has clearly been ill for longer than a few weeks, he said quietly. The child too, though she's handling it better. They've been through something, Harlan. Something bad. I figured as much. And you're still willing to take them in? Even though you don't know them? Even though they're strangers who could be anyone? Harlan leaned against the porch railing, staring out at his land. You think I should turn them away? I think I'm surprised you're not. The Harlan Gage I know has spent the last 6 years avoiding human contact like it's contagious. Morrison's voice was gentle, but pointed. What changed? Harlan was silent for a long moment, searching for an answer that made sense. Finally, he said, That little girl asked me for help. Just asked, straight out. No shame or manipulation. and I realized I was about to become the kind of man who says no to that. He looked at Morrison. I spent 4 years in a war watching people die because no one would help them. I came home and watched my brother die because I wasn't there when he needed me. Maybe I'm just tired of watching people die. Morrison's expression softened. She's not going to die, Harlan, not if we treat her properly. But I need you to understand what you're taking on. Even if she recovers fully, which I believe she will, it's going to be at least 2 weeks before she's well enough to travel. Maybe 3. That's 2 or 3 weeks of having people in your house, in your space, depending on you. Are you truly ready for that? No, Harlan thought, but he said, I'll manage. The doctor studied him a moment longer, then nodded. I'll come back in 3 days to check on her. Sooner if you send for me. And Harlan? He paused at the steps. This is a good thing you're doing. I know you might not see it that way, but it is. After Morrison left, Harlan stood on the porch for a long time, watching the sun continue its arc across the sky. From inside the house, he could hear the faint sounds of Annie moving around, the creak of the chair as she settled in to keep watch over her mother. His house, which had been silent for so long, now held voices and footsteps and life. And Harlan couldn't decide if that terrified him or comforted him. Eventually, he forced himself to move, to check on the animals and do the evening chores that kept the ranch running. But he found his attention constantly drifting back to the house, to the window of Thomas's room where lamplight now glowed. He took longer than usual with his tasks, procrastinating the moment when he'd have to go back inside and face the reality of what he'd agreed to. When he finally entered the house, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He found Annie in the kitchen, standing on a chair she'd dragged over to the counter, trying to figure out how his stove worked. I thought I could make some soup, she said when she saw him. Mama needs to eat when she wakes up, and soup is easy on sick people. But I can't get the fire started right. Harlan crossed to the stove and showed her how to work the damper and arrange the kindling. Within minutes, they had a fire going, and Annie was carefully measuring water into a pot with the seriousness of someone performing surgery. We have some vegetables in our bag, she said. Not much, but enough for a small pot, and I found some salt in your cupboard. I hope that's all right. It's fine. Harlan watched as she worked with careful efficiency, her small hands moving with practiced competence. You've done this before. Lots of times. Mama taught me. She said a woman needs to know how to make food from nothing, because sometimes nothing is all you have. Annie's voice was matter-of-fact, but there was an edge of sadness beneath it. When Papa was alive, we had more. He had a store in Missouri. But then he got sick, and the medicine was expensive, and after he died, there were debts, and the bank took the store, and our house and everything. She said it all without self-pity, just reciting facts. But Harlan could read between the lines, could see the shape of their story in what she didn't say. A widow with a child and no money, probably no family willing or able to help, forced to take whatever options presented themselves. And now here they were, in a stranger's house, dependent on the charity of a man who'd spent years refusing to care about anyone. I'm sorry, Harlan said, inadequate words for the weight of loss this child had experienced. Annie looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, she smiled. A real smile, small but genuine. It's all right, she said. We're all right now. You're helping us. The trust in her voice, the absolute certainty that he would keep them safe, terrified Harlan more than anything else that had happened that day. They ate simple soup that evening, Annie and Harlan sitting at his kitchen table while Clara slept in the other room. Annie talked as they ate, filling the silence with stories about her life before, about her father's store and the cat they'd had and her friends at school. Harlan mostly listened, offering occasional grunts of acknowledgement, but found himself oddly comforted by the sound of her voice. When the meal was done, Annie insisted on cleaning up, moving around his kitchen with careful attention to putting everything back exactly where she'd found it. Then she looked at Harlan with sudden uncertainty. Mr. Gage? Where should I sleep? Harlan hadn't thought that far ahead. Thomas's room was occupied by Clara. The only other bedroom was his own. There was the parlor, he supposed, where he could make up a pallet in the kitchen. You take the parlor, he said finally. I'll bring some blankets. He made her a makeshift bed on the old sofa, piling on quilts until she was cocooned in softness. Annie climbed in gratefully, her eyes already drooping with exhaustion. But before Harlan could leave, her small hand caught his sleeve. "Mr. Gage, will you check on Mama during the night, in case she needs something?" "I will," Harlan promised. "And if something bad happens, you'll come get me right away." "I will." Annie studied his face in the lamplight, then nodded, satisfied. "You're a good man," she said softly. "I knew it when I first saw you. Mama says you can always tell a person's heart by their eyes, and your eyes are kind even when you try to look mean." Harlan didn't know what to say to that, so he simply tucked the blanket more firmly around her and turned down the lamp. He checked on Clara before going to his own room. She was sleeping deeply, her breathing labored but steady. In the lamplight, he could see her more clearly than he had before, could see that beneath the illness and exhaustion, she was probably pretty. She had fine features, a determined chin, brown hair that fell in waves around her face. There was something peaceful about her expression in sleep, as if the weight of worry she carried while awake had temporarily lifted. Harlan found himself wondering about her life before this, about the husband she'd lost and the home that had been taken from her. He wondered what it took to keep going after everything fell apart, to keep your child safe and hopeful when you had nothing left but determination. And he wondered, with a feeling uncomfortably close to fear, what it would mean for him if he started to care about the answers to those questions. In his own room, Harlan lay awake listening to the sounds of his house, sounds he'd forgotten or maybe had never really known. The creak of someone settling into sleep, the soft sigh of a sick woman shifting position, the whisper of breath that meant he wasn't alone anymore. He should have found it invasive, this disruption of his carefully maintained solitude. Instead, he found it almost comforting. Around midnight, he heard Clara coughing, a deep, racking sound that spoke of pain. Harlan rose and padded quietly to her room, finding her awake and struggling to sit up. "Easy," he said, moving to help her. He positioned pillows behind her back, easing her into a half-sitting position that Morrison had said would help her breathing. "Better?" Clara nodded, her hand pressed to her chest. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't. I wasn't sleeping." Harlan poured water from the pitcher Morrison had left and held it to her lips. She drank gratefully, her hands too weak to hold the cup herself. When she'd finished, she leaned back against the pillows, her eyes studying him in the darkness. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked. "The doctor, the medicine, letting us stay in your house. It's too much for strangers. There has to be a reason." Harlan set down the cup, considering his answer. He could lie, could offer some easy explanation that would satisfy her curiosity without revealing anything real. But something about the darkness, about her weakness and his weariness, made him tell the truth. "Because 6 years ago, my brother needed help, and I wasn't there to give it," he said quietly. "And I've been living with that ever since. So when your daughter asked me for help, I guess I figured I could either be the person who turns away or the person who doesn't, and I was tired of being the first kind." Clara was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry about your brother." "Me too." "We won't be a burden," she said. "As soon as I'm well enough, we'll leave. We're heading to Oregon. My sisters are there. They've been writing, asking us to come." "Why didn't you go to them after your husband died?" "Pride, I suppose, and shame. They married well, have comfortable lives. I didn't want to show up on their doorsteps as the poor widow who couldn't manage on her own." She smiled faintly. "Turns out I couldn't manage anyway, so now I have to swallow that pride." "There's no shame in needing help," Harlan said, echoing words he'd heard but never quite believed. "No," Clara agreed, "but there's shame in other things, in the choices you make when you're desperate, in the things you almost do to survive." She looked at him directly. "I want you to know, Mr. Gage, that we're respectable. Whatever the town might think, whatever assumptions they might make about a widow and her child staying with a bachelor, I'm not. "I know," Harlan said firmly. "And anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me." Claire's eyes widened slightly. "You barely know us. Why would you defend our reputation?" "Because," Harlan said, surprising himself with the answer, "kindness isn't something we owe. It's what keeps us human. Claire's breath caught, and Harlan realized he'd just repeated her own words back to her, words Annie must have told him she'd said. A smile ghosted across her pale face. Yes, she whispered. Exactly that. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and Harlan found himself noticing details he'd missed before. The way lamplight caught in her hair, the delicate structure of her hands, the quiet strength in her eyes, despite her weakened state. There was something about Clara Wells that drew him, something beyond simple compassion for her circumstances, and that Harlan realized with a jolt of alarm was dangerous. You should rest, he said abruptly, standing. I'll check on you again in a few hours. Mr. Gage? Claire's voice stopped him at the door. Thank you. Not just for the help, but for seeing us as people worth helping. You'd be surprised how rare that is. Harlan didn't trust himself to respond, so he simply nodded and retreated to his own room, his heart beating faster than it should. The next few days fell into a pattern that was both strange and oddly comfortable. Harlan tended to his ranch work during the day, while Annie took charge of her mother's care with a competence that continued to astound him. She administered medicine on schedule, prepared simple meals, kept the sick room clean and aired out. She even somehow found time to sweep the house, organize his chaotic pantry, and mend more of his clothes. You don't have to do all that, Harlan told her when he found her scrubbing his kitchen floor on the third day. I like to be useful, Annie replied simply. And besides, you're letting us stay here. The least I can do is help keep your house nice. In the evenings, after chores were done, Harlan found himself sitting in Clara's room while Annie played quietly in the parlor or slept. Clara was awake more often now, the fever gradually breaking under Morrison's treatment. They talked, cautiously at first, then with increasing ease. She told him about her life in Missouri, about her husband who'd been kind but not particularly good with money, about the struggle to keep going after he died. I tried to make it work, she said one night. Tried to find work, but no one wants to hire a widow with a child. They think you'll be unreliable, or they think... She paused delicately. They think you'll be desperate enough to accept indecent proposals, Harlan finished bluntly. Claire's cheeks flushed, but she nodded. I had 3 different men offer me protection if I'd be accommodating, as if I'd trade my dignity for security. Her voice hardened. I'd rather live in a barn than do that. Which is how you ended up at my fence, Harlan said. Which is how we ended up very, very lucky, Clara corrected. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You're not what I expected, Mr. Gage. What did you expect? I don't know. Someone who'd help grudgingly, maybe. Someone who'd make us feel like a burden. But you don't. Even when I can see it costs you something to have us here, you don't make us feel unwelcome. Harlan shifted uncomfortably. It's just basic decency. No, Clara said softly. It's more than that. Basic decency would have been pointing us toward town and giving us water. This, caring for a stranger, disrupting your life, defending our reputation, this is kindness. And kindness, Mr. Gage, is never basic. Their eyes met, and Harlan felt something pass between them. A recognition, an understanding, a connection that scared him as much as it compelled him. He stood abruptly, muttering something about checking the animals, and fled into the night. But he could still feel her gaze on him, could still hear her voice saying his name with a gentleness he didn't deserve. And he knew, standing under the vast Kansas sky with stars scattered like seeds across the darkness, that his carefully constructed walls were crumbling faster than he could rebuild them. Inside the house, lamplight glowed in the windows. Inside were voices and laughter and life. Inside was a woman who looked at him like he mattered, and a child who trusted him absolutely. Inside was everything Harlan had convinced himself he didn't want and didn't need. And the terrifying truth was that he was starting to want it so badly, it hurt. The change came gradually, like dawn creeping across the plains, so subtle that Harlan didn't notice it happening until it had already transformed everything. By the end of the first week, Clara was sitting up for short periods, her fever finally broken and her breathing easier. Annie had bloomed under the security of regular meals and a safe place to sleep, her face filling out, her smiles coming more freely. And Harlan found himself doing things he'd sworn he'd never do again, setting 3 places at the table instead of 1, listening for footsteps in the hallway, feeling his chest tighten with something dangerously close to contentment when Annie's laughter rang through his house. It was during the second week that word reached town about the arrangement at the Gage Ranch. Harlan had known it was inevitable. In a town the size of Millbrook, secrets lasted about as long as morning dew in August. Dr. Morrison had been discreet, but the general store clerk had noticed Harlan buying more supplies than usual, including items no bachelor would need. A ranch hand who'd been looking for work had ridden out to the property and seen Annie playing in the yard. By the time these small observations made their rounds through the saloons and sewing circles, they'd been twisted and embellished until the story bore little resemblance to truth. Harlan first heard the whispers on a Wednesday afternoon when he rode into town for supplies. He'd left Annie reading to her mother from one of Thomas's old books, both of them comfortable and healing, neither aware that the simple act of their presence in his home was being discussed and dissected by people who'd never met them. The general store was busy when Harlan entered, and the conversation that had been flowing freely came to an abrupt halt. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, stopped mid-sentence and stared at him with an expression that managed to be both scandalized and grimly satisfied, as if she'd been proven right about something she'd long suspected. Her companion, Mrs. Yates, clutched her packages tighter and turned away, making a show of examining bolts of fabric with sudden fascination. Harlan ignored them, moving to the counter where Sam Tucker, the store owner, stood looking decidedly uncomfortable. "Harlan," Sam said, his greeting carefully neutral, "what can I do for you?" "Need flour, sugar, some coffee if you have it fresh," Harlan said, pulling out his list. "And I need to settle my account." As Sam gathered the items, Harlan became aware of Mrs. Henderson whispering to her friend, her voice just loud enough to ensure it would carry. "Staying right there in his house, if you can believe it. A widow woman with a child, and him a bachelor, no chaperone, no propriety. Why, when I think of what must be going on under that roof—" "Mrs. Henderson," Sam said sharply, his face reddening, "that's enough." But she wasn't finished. "I'm simply saying what everyone's thinking, Samuel. It's not proper. That poor child exposed to such an arrangement. Someone should inform the authorities. There are institutions for women of that type, places where—" Harlan's hand slammed down on the counter with enough force to make everyone in the store jump. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of cold fury that made grown men take a step back. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm going to say this once, and I suggest you listen carefully." He turned to face her, and she actually paled at whatever she saw in his expression. "Mrs. Wells and her daughter are under my protection. Mrs. Wells has been gravely ill with pneumonia, and I provided shelter out of basic human decency, a quality that seems to be in short supply in this town. If you or anyone else spreads lies about them, if you damage their reputation with your filthy insinuations, you'll answer to me personally. Do I make myself clear?" Mrs. Henderson's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. "Well, I never, No, I don't suppose you have," Harlan said coldly. "Never shown kindness without expecting something in return. Never helped someone without judging them. Never thought that maybe your vicious gossip does more harm than whatever you imagine you're protecting people from." "Mr. Gage," Mrs. Yates ventured timidly, "we're only concerned about propriety. Surely you can understand—" "What I understand," Harlan interrupted, "is that a woman and her child were dying on the side of the road, and the good people of Millbrook turned them away. What I understand is that you're more concerned with appearances than with actual morality. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop talking about Mrs. Wells. You're going to stop looking at her with judgment if you happen to see her. And you're going to remember that Christians are supposed to help the sick and shelter the homeless, not tear them down with gossip." He turned back to Sam, who was staring at him with something like awe. "How much do I owe you?" Sam named a figure, and Harlan paid it, gathering his supplies. As he headed for the door, Mrs. Henderson found her voice again, pitched to sound wounded rather than malicious. "We're only thinking of you, Mr. Gage. Your reputation matters too. People will talk, and once a man's reputation is sullied—" Harlan stopped at the door and looked back at her. "Mrs. Henderson, I spent 4 years in a war where I watched men die in ways you can't imagine. I came home and buried my brother. My reputation is the least of my concerns. Let people talk. I'll survive." He left before she could respond, loading his supplies into the wagon with hands that shook slightly from residual anger. He'd known there would be gossip, but he hadn't anticipated how much it would infuriate him. Not for himself. He'd meant what he said about not caring what people thought of him. But for Clara and Annie, who'd already been through so much, to have their characters questioned by people who didn't know the first thing about them. Harlan. He turned to find Sheriff Tom Bradley approaching, his expression carefully neutral. Bradley was a good man, fair and steady, and Harlan respected him even if they'd never been close friends. "Tom, heard you just about took Mrs. Henderson's head off in there," Bradley said mildly. "She was spreading lies about my house guests." "So I gathered." Bradley leaned against the wagon, studying Harlan. "Look, I'm not here to lecture you. Far as I'm concerned, what you do on your own property is your business. But I wanted you to know that the talk is spreading, and it's not all friendly. Some folks are wondering if maybe the child welfare should be involved, if the situation is appropriate for a young girl." Harlan felt ice settle in his stomach. "They want to take Annie away. I'm saying some people are asking questions, and while I don't agree with them, I am responsible for the welfare of children in this county." Bradley held up a hand as Harlan's face darkened. "I'm not threatening you. I'm warning you. Dr. Morrison vouched for the situation being medical necessity, and I believe him. But if you want to shut down the gossip, the easiest way would be to make the situation more conventional." "Meaning what?" "Meaning get Mrs. Wells settled somewhere more appropriate once she's well enough. Or," Bradley paused significantly, "make the arrangement legitimate." Harlan stared at him. "You're suggesting I marry her." "I'm suggesting that married people living under one roof raises no eyebrows, while an unmarried man and woman doing so raises plenty. But that's a decision only you can make." Bradley pushed off from the wagon. "Just thought you should know where things stand. For what it's worth, I think you did a good thing, helping them. Don't let the gossips make you regret it." As Bradley walked away, Harlan stood frozen, his mind reeling. Marriage. The word itself felt foreign, impossible. He'd barely spoken to a woman in 6 years, had convinced himself he'd spend the rest of his life alone. And now a small-town sheriff was casually suggesting he marry a woman he'd known for less than 2 weeks, a woman who was depending on him for help, who had no choice but to accept whatever he offered. The thought made him sick. Not because he found Clara unappealing, quite the opposite, which was its own problem, but because suggesting marriage to someone in her position felt like the worst kind of coercion. She was vulnerable, desperate, and dependent on his charity. How could she possibly say no, even if she wanted to? How could any proposal under these circumstances be anything but him taking advantage of her situation? No. He wouldn't do that to her. He'd weather the gossip, deal with any official inquiries, and when Clara was well enough, he'd help her get to Oregon as originally planned. It was the only honorable course of action. But as he drove home, Bradley's words echoed in his mind. Make the arrangement legitimate. He found Clara sitting in a chair by the window when he returned, the first time she'd been out of bed for more than a few minutes. She was wrapped in one of his mother's old shawls, her hair loose around her shoulders, and she turned to smile at him when he entered. The smile faded when she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately. "What happened in town?" Harlan set down the supplies, searching for the right words. Annie was outside, playing with a stick and some rocks she'd arranged into what she claimed was a castle, so at least he didn't have to worry about her overhearing. "There's talk," he said finally, "about you being here, about the arrangement being improper." Clara's face went white, then red with humiliation. "I see," she said quietly. "Of course there is. How foolish of me to think—" She stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth. "We'll leave. As soon as I can travel, we'll leave. I won't have your reputation damaged because of us." "That's not what I want," Harlan said quickly. "It doesn't matter what you want. We can't stay here if it's causing you problems." Clara's voice was steady, but he could see tears gathering in her eyes. "We've already taken too much from you. I won't take your good name too. My good name is my concern, not yours." "But Annie," Clara's voice broke. "If they think the situation is inappropriate, if they involve authorities, they could take her from me. Say I'm an unfit mother. Say I'm living in sin or some such nonsense. The tears spilled over now, tracking down her pale cheeks. She's all I have, Mr. Gage. I can't lose her. I can't. Harlan crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, pulling out his handkerchief and pressing it into her hands. No one is taking Annie anywhere. I promise you that. You can't promise that. You can't control what people say or what the law decides. Then we'll make it so they have nothing to say, Harlan heard himself say. The words came out before he'd fully formed the thought, driven by the panic in Clara's eyes and his own desperate need to fix this, to make her safe. We'll get married. Clara froze, the handkerchief pressed to her face, staring at him with an expression of complete shock. What? If we're married, there's no impropriety. No grounds for anyone to question the arrangement or threaten to take Annie. It solves everything. Harlan, you can't. Clara shook her head violently. You can't marry me out of pity or obligation. That's not fair to either of us. It's not pity, Harlan said, realizing as he spoke that it was true. And yes, there's obligation, but not the kind you think. I brought you here, made you part of my household. That makes your welfare my responsibility. And if marrying you protects you and Annie, then that's what I'll do. But what about what you want? Clara asked desperately. What about your life, your freedom? I won't trap you into a marriage you don't want just to save myself. Harlan sat back on his heels, looking at this woman who, even sick and terrified, was more concerned about his welfare than her own. What I want, he said slowly, is to not spend the rest of my life wondering if you and Annie made it safely to Oregon. What I want is to not lie awake at night thinking about what might happen to you once you leave here. What I want is... He paused, surprised by the truth of what he was about to say. What I want is for you to stay. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them was quite ready to examine. Clara's hand found his where it rested on the arm of her chair, her fingers cold and trembling. You don't know me, she whispered. Not really. What if you regret it? What if I don't? Harlan countered. Clara, I'm not promising you romance or grand passion. I don't know if I'm capable of that anymore. But I can promise you safety. I can promise you a home, food, security for Annie. I can promise that no one will ever turn you away or make you feel like a burden again. Is that enough? Clara searched his face, and Harlan forced himself to meet her gaze steadily, to let her see whatever truth was written there. Finally, she said, what if it's not about what's enough? What if it's about what's right? Harlan, you're a good man. You deserve more than a marriage of convenience to a woman you barely know. Maybe I deserve exactly what I'm asking for, Harlan said. A second chance to be useful. A reason to care about something beyond the next day's work. Maybe you'd be doing me a favor. That's not how marriage should work. And how should it work? Harlan asked, more sharply than he intended. Everyone marries for reasons, Clara. Some marry for love, some for security, some because it's expected. We'd be marrying for mutual benefit and honesty. That's more than a lot of people start with. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her hand still covering his. Outside, they could hear Annie singing to herself, that same lullaby she'd been singing the night they arrived. The sound of it, so innocent and trusting, seemed to make up Clara's mind. If we do this, she said carefully, it needs to be clear that it's a practical arrangement. I won't have you thinking I'm trying to trap you or take advantage. And if you ever want out, if you ever regret this decision, you tell me and we'll figure something out. I won't regret it, Harlan said with more certainty than he felt. You can't know that. No, he admitted, but I'm willing to risk it. The question is, are you? Clara took a shaky breath, then nodded. Yes, for Annie's sake, if nothing else. She needs stability, needs a home. And she's already attached to you, trusts you. That's worth more than whatever romantic notions I might have once had about marriage. The words should have felt like victory. But instead, Harlan felt an odd sense of loss. He pushed it aside, standing and offering Clara his hand to help her back to bed. Rest, he said. I'll talk to Dr. Morrison when he comes tomorrow. See what he says about you being well enough for a trip into town. We'll need a license, a minister. Harlan? Clara stopped him at the door. Thank you, not just for this, but for everything. I know you see it as obligation, but to me, to us, it's salvation. Harlan nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and left before she could see how much her words affected him. He found Annie in the yard and called her over, deciding she needed to know what was being planned. She came running, her face bright with the joy of a child who'd finally found security. "Annie, I need to talk to you about something important," Harlan said, kneeling so they were eye to eye. "Your mother and I have been discussing the future, and we think it would be best if your mother and I got married." Annie's eyes went wide, and for a moment Harlan couldn't read her expression. Then a smile broke across her face like sunrise. "Really? You mean we could stay here forever? This could be our home." "If that's what you want," Harlan said carefully. "But I need you to understand this doesn't mean I'm replacing your father. I could never do that. I'm going to be here, to take care of you both." Annie threw her arms around his neck with such force she nearly knocked him over. "I think Papa would like you," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "I think he'd be glad we found someone good to look after us." Harlan held her awkwardly, unused to displays of affection but unwilling to push her away. Over her shoulder he could see Clara watching from the window, one hand pressed against the glass, her face a mix of emotions too complex to name. And Harlan thought, not for the first time, that he'd somehow managed to step into a life he'd never planned for, never wanted, and yet couldn't quite bring himself to walk away from. Dr. Morrison arrived the next morning for his scheduled visit, and after examining Clara and declaring her on the mend, Harlan pulled him aside for a private conversation. Morrison listened to the plan with raised eyebrows and a thoughtful expression. "Marriage, Harlan? That's a significant step. It's a practical solution to a practical problem." "Is it?" Morrison studied him with the penetrating gaze of someone who'd spent decades reading people. "Or is it something more that you're not ready to admit yet? Does it matter?" "It might. To you, eventually." Morrison sighed. "But I won't argue with your reasoning. The talk in town has been ugly, and it would indeed solve the problem. Mrs. Wells is agreeable?" "She is." "And you're certain this is what you want? Because once you make this commitment, Harlan, you can't unmake it without causing even more damage." Harlan thought about Clara's hand in his, about Annie's arms around his neck, about the way his house had felt less like a tomb and more like a home over the past 2 weeks. "I'm certain," he said. Morrison nodded slowly. "Then I'll speak to Reverend Williams. He owes me a favor. I treated his son's broken arm last year and never collected the full fee. I'll see if he's willing to perform a quiet ceremony. Given the medical circumstances, I think we can arrange something quickly without too much fuss." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Morrison said dryly. "Marriage is complicated under the best circumstances, and these are hardly the best circumstances. You're going to have to work at it, Harlan. Both of you are." "I know." But Harlan wasn't sure he did know. Wasn't sure he understood what he was really signing up for. All he knew was that the alternative, letting Clara and Annie leave, watching them disappear down the road toward an uncertain future, was unthinkable. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Word spread quickly through town that Harlan Gage and the widow Wells were to be married, and reactions ranged from approval to scandal, depending on who was talking. Mrs. Henderson made it known that she found the hasty marriage highly suspicious, while others saw it as Harlan doing the honorable thing. Sheriff Bradley stopped by to offer his congratulations and assure Harlan that the marriage would put an end to any official concerns about the arrangement. Clara grew stronger each day, able to walk around the house and take short trips outside. She and Harlan moved around each other with careful politeness, neither quite sure how to navigate this new understanding between them. They discussed practical matters, where she and Annie would sleep after the wedding, Thomas's room would become theirs, how household responsibilities would be divided, what Annie's education would look like, but they carefully avoided talking about anything deeper. Annie, by contrast, was delighted with the entire situation. She threw herself into preparing for the wedding with the enthusiasm of someone planning a fairy tale. She picked wildflowers and arranged them in jars. She insisted on washing and mending Clara's best dress. She even tried to convince Harlan to wear his father's pocket watch, which he'd kept in a drawer for years. "You have to look nice," she insisted. "It's your wedding day." "It's not that kind of wedding," Harlan tried to explain. "It's just a simple ceremony, nothing fancy." But Annie wouldn't hear it. Every wedding should be special, she said, with the absolute certainty of childhood. Even if it's just us, it should still be special. So Harlan found himself digging out his good suit, the one he'd worn to his mother's funeral and hadn't touched since. He cleaned his father's pocket watch, polished his boots, even let Annie convince him to let her trim his hair with the kitchen scissors. On the morning of the wedding, Harlan woke early and stood on his porch watching the sun rise over the Kansas plains. In a few hours, he'd be a married man. In a few hours, his life would change in ways he still couldn't fully comprehend. Part of him wanted to run, to saddle his horse and ride until he couldn't hear the voice in his head telling him he was making a mistake. But a larger part, the part that had grown over the past 2 weeks, the part that had been dormant for 6 years, knew he was exactly where he needed to be. Dr. Morrison arrived mid-morning with Reverend Williams, a thin, serious man in his 50s who looked at Harlan with a mixture of sympathy and concern. "Mr. Gage," he said, shaking Harlan's hand, "Dr. Morrison has explained the circumstances. I want you to understand that marriage is a sacred covenant, not to be entered into lightly." "I understand, Reverend." "Do you? Because while I appreciate that you're trying to protect Mrs. Wells and her daughter, marriage requires more than good intentions. It requires commitment, patience, and faith." "I'm aware of what it requires," Harlan said, more sharply than he intended. "And I wouldn't be doing this if I wasn't prepared to honor those requirements." William studied him a moment longer, then nodded. "Very well. Where's the bride?" Clara emerged from the house a few minutes later, and Harlan felt his breath catch. She'd dressed in her best, a simple blue dress that she and Annie had spent the previous evening pressing and mending. Her hair was pulled back in a soft knot, and she'd found some ribbon somewhere to weave through it. She was still too thin, still pale from illness, but there was a quiet dignity in the way she carried herself that made her beautiful. She walked to Harlan's side, and they stood together facing the Reverend while Morrison and Annie served as witnesses. Sheriff Bradley had also shown up, explaining quietly that his presence would help establish the legality of the ceremony for anyone who might question it later. The ceremony was brief and businesslike. Williams spoke about duty and commitment, about the responsibilities of marriage, and the sanctity of the family. Harlan barely heard him, too focused on Clara's hand in his, small and cool, trembling slightly. He wondered what she was thinking, whether she was regretting this decision, whether she was afraid. "Do you, Harlan Gage, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Harlan said, his voice steady. "And do you, Clara Wells, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Clara's hand tightened on Harlan's. "I do," she whispered. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Williams closed his Bible with a decisive snap. "Mr. Gage, you may kiss your bride." Harlan hadn't anticipated this part, hadn't thought beyond the words and the legality. He looked at Clara, saw her eyes widen slightly, and felt panic claw at his throat. But this was what people expected, what would make the marriage seem real and legitimate. So he leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and pressed a brief, chaste kiss to her lips. It lasted only a second, barely more than a brush of contact, but Harlan felt it like a brand. Clara's lips were soft and warm, and the brief contact sparked something in him he'd thought long dead. When he pulled back, her cheeks were flushed and her eyes were bright with tears she was fighting to control. "Congratulations," Morrison said warmly, breaking the tension. "Mrs. Gage, welcome to the family." Mrs. Gage. The name sounded foreign, impossible. Clara seemed to feel it too, her hand flying to her mouth as if she could catch the reality before it fully settled. Annie had no such reservations. She launched herself at both of them, wrapping her arms around their legs and laughing with pure joy. "We're a family now," she announced. "A real family." And Harlan thought, looking down at this child who'd somehow claimed a piece of his heart, that maybe she was right. Maybe they were a family, strange and cobbled together though they might be. Maybe that's what family was, not blood or tradition, but choice and commitment, and showing up even when it was hard. After the witnesses left, the three of them stood in the yard, none quite sure what came next. The marriage was legal and binding, but it still felt surreal, as if they were all playing parts in someone else's story. "Well," Clara said finally, her voice determinedly cheerful, "I suppose I should start dinner. Wives make dinner for their families, don't they?" "You don't have to," Harlan started. "I want to," Clara interrupted. "I want things to feel normal, or as normal as they can be, given the circumstances." She disappeared into the house, Annie trailing after her, leaving Harlan alone with his thoughts and his newly acquired responsibilities. He looked at the ring on his finger, a simple gold band that had belonged to his father, and tried to process the reality that he was married, that he had a wife and, in essence, a daughter, that his life had been irrevocably changed by a desperate question asked 2 weeks ago at his fence line. That night, after dinner was eaten and Annie was settled in bed, Harlan and Clara faced the awkward reality of sleeping arrangements. They'd discussed it earlier, agreed that Clara and Annie would continue to share Thomas's room for now, that there was no pressure to make the marriage more than what it needed to be legally. But as Clara stood in the doorway of what was now her room, she turned back to look at Harlan with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for your honor, for not expecting, for giving me time." "Take all the time you need," Harlan said. "This marriage is on your terms, Clara, whatever you're comfortable with." "And what about what you're comfortable with?" she asked. "What about what you need?" Harlan had no answer for that. He wasn't sure himself what he needed, or if he even had the right to need anything beyond what he'd already gotten, a second chance, a reason to care, a house that felt less like a tomb. "Good night, Clara," he said, instead of answering. "Good night, Harlan," she replied, and closed the door between them. Harlan stood in the hallway for a long moment, then retreated to his own room. He lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of his house, Clara's soft breathing, Annie's occasional sleep murmurs, the creak of wood settling, different sounds than the ones he'd grown accustomed to, but becoming familiar in their own right. And he thought about the words he'd spoken at his fence line, words that now seemed prophetic. Let them talk. I'll survive. He would survive this. The marriage, the gossip, the complicated tangle of emotions he wasn't ready to examine. He'd survived war and loss, and 6 years of self-imposed exile. He could survive having a family again. What scared him wasn't survival. It was the possibility that surviving might not be enough anymore, that after years of merely existing, he might actually want to live again. And living, Harlan was starting to understand, meant opening himself up to all the pain and joy and messy complication he'd been avoiding. It meant caring about people who could hurt him, who could leave him, who could die and take pieces of his heart with them. It meant risk. But as he finally drifted towards sleep, he found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, some risks were worth taking. The first weeks of marriage passed in a careful dance of proximity and distance, of learning to share space with someone while maintaining the boundaries they'd agreed upon. Harlan woke each morning to the smell of coffee he hadn't made and breakfast he hadn't cooked, to the sound of Annie's chatter and Clara's soft responses. He came in from working the fields to find his clothes mended, his house cleaned, flowers on the table that hadn't been there when he left. Small changes, incremental shifts, but together they transformed his house into something he hadn't allowed it to be for 6 years. A home. Clara moved through her new role with quiet competence, managing the household as if she'd been doing it forever. She was careful never to overstep, always asking before rearranging anything, making it clear through 1,000 small gestures that she understood this was still his space, that she was a guest, even though the law said otherwise. It drove Harlan half mad with frustration he couldn't quite articulate, this constant deference, as if she was afraid he'd regret his decision and send them away. "You don't have to ask permission to use the good dishes," he said one evening when she'd inquired about setting the table with his mother's china. "You live here now, Clara. This is your house, too." "Old habits," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm still getting used to the idea that I have a right to be here." "You're my wife. You have every right." But even as he said it, Harlan knew the words rang hollow. They were married in law and in name, but there was a distance between them that no legal document could bridge. They were polite strangers sharing a house, dancing around each other with the careful courtesy of people afraid to step on toes or cross unspoken lines. Annie, by contrast, adapted to their new life with the resilience of childhood. She appointed herself Harlan's shadow, following him on his morning rounds, peppering him with questions about the ranch, the animals, the land. She had an endless curiosity about everything and a fearlessness that sometimes made Harlan's heart stop. "Can I help feed the horses?" she asked one morning, standing on tiptoe to peer into the stalls. "They're big animals, Annie. They could hurt you without meaning to." "But you'll teach me to be careful, won't you?" She looked up at him with such trust that Harlan found himself nodding before he'd consciously decided to agree. So he taught her how to approach a horse, how to read their moods, how to curry their coats and clean their hooves. He showed her how to gather eggs without startling the chickens, how to milk the cow that he'd recently purchased so Annie could have fresh milk, how to mend a fence and judge when hay was ready for cutting. She absorbed it all with the intensity of someone who'd been starving for exactly this kind of knowledge, this kind of connection. "Papa used to let me help in the store," she told him one afternoon as they worked together mucking out stalls. "I was real good at counting change and wrapping parcels. But I like this better. I like being outside, working with my hands." "Your mother must worry," Harlan said. "Seeing you do work meant for grown men." Annie shrugged. "Mama knows I need to be useful. She says everyone needs to contribute, no matter how small they are." She paused, leaning on her small shovel. "Do you think I'm useful, Mr. Gage?" "You can call me Harlan, we're family now." "Mama says that's disrespectful, that I should call you Mr. Gage or Sir." Harlan considered this. Clara was trying to maintain proper boundaries, to make sure Annie understood the formal nature of their arrangement, but something about the little girl calling him Mr. Gage, when they were shoveling manure together, felt absurd. "How about just Harlan, when it's the two of us?" he suggested. "You can use Mr. Gage when other people are around, if it makes your mother feel better." Annie's face lit up. "Really? You mean it?" "I mean it." She tested the name carefully, as if tasting something new. "Harlan, it's a strong name. I like it." Then, going back to her earlier question with the persistence that Harlan was learning was characteristic of her. "But do you think I'm useful? Or am I just in the way?" Harlan stopped working and looked at her seriously. "Annie, you're one of the most useful people I know. You work harder than most adults, and you never complain. I don't know what I'd do without your help." The smile she gave him was so brilliant it hurt to look at, and Harlan realized with a jolt of something like fear that this child had worked her way completely into his heart. That if anything happened to her, if she was taken away or hurt or lost, it would break him in ways the war and Thomas's death hadn't managed. It was terrifying, this vulnerability, this caring. And yet he couldn't seem to stop it. That evening, as had become their habit, the three of them ate dinner together at the kitchen table. Clara had made a stew from vegetables she'd planted in the garden. Another small change, the appearance of neat rows of growing things where there'd been only weeds before. Annie talked about everything she'd learned that day, and Clara listened with a mother's patient attention, occasionally catching Harlan's eye over their daughter's head with a look of shared amusement. It was during one of these ordinary moments that Harlan had the unsettling realization that he was happy. Not content or resigned or merely not miserable, but actually happy. The thought terrified him almost as much as it pleased him, because happiness was a fragile thing, easily shattered, and he'd learned through bitter experience not to trust it. After Annie was sent to bed, Clara and Harlan lingered over coffee in the lamplight. It had become their routine, these quiet evening conversations where they talked about the day's events, about Annie's progress, about plans for the ranch. Safe topics, surface topics, nothing that required either of them to reveal too much. But tonight, Clara broke the pattern. "Harlan," she said, her voice hesitant, "can I ask you something personal?" He felt his walls go up immediately, instinctive defense against anything that might require vulnerability. But he forced himself to nod. "All right. Why did you really agree to this? To marrying me?" She held up a hand when he started to give his practiced answer. "Not the reasons you told me before, about protecting us or doing the honorable thing. The real reason. Because I don't think you're the kind of man who does things purely out of duty." Harlan stared into his coffee cup, watching steam rise and dissipate. He could lie, could retreat behind the explanations he'd been giving himself. But Clara deserved honesty, even if it made him uncomfortable to give it. I was dying, he said finally. Not literally, but inside. Every day was the same. Wake up, work, go to bed. No purpose beyond survival, no connection to anything or anyone. I'd convinced myself that's what I wanted, that being alone kept me safe. And then Annie asked me that question at the fence, and something cracked open in me. Something I'd thought was dead. Clara waited, not pushing, just listening. The truth is, Harlan continued, you and Annie saved me as much as I saved you. Maybe more. Because what's the point of surviving if you're not really living? And I hadn't been living for 6 years. I'd just been existing. And now? Clara asked softly. Now I'm terrified, Harlan admitted. Because living means caring about things, and caring about things means they can hurt you. You can hurt me. Annie can hurt me. Not intentionally, but just by being mortal, by being people who can leave or die or decide they'd rather be somewhere else. Clara reached across the table and took his hand, the first time she'd initiated physical contact since their wedding day kiss. Her touch was warm and solid and real. I'm terrified too, she said, of disappointing you, of failing to be what you need, of waking up one day and realizing you regret this decision. But Harlan, terror isn't a reason not to try. Sometimes it's a reason to try harder. Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition, a possibility. Harlan's thumb moved almost unconsciously against her hand, a small caress that felt monumental given how carefully they'd been avoiding this kind of intimacy. I don't regret it, he said, marrying you. In case you were wondering, I know it's only been a few weeks, but I don't regret it. Neither do I, Clara whispered. Even though it's not what either of us planned, even though it's complicated and strange and probably looks ridiculous to anyone on the outside, I don't regret it. They sat like that for a long moment, hands joined across the table, before Clara gently pulled away and stood to clear the dishes. But something had shifted between them. Some barrier had been breached, and Harlan could feel it in the air like the electricity before a storm. The change in their relationship became more apparent over the following days. Small touches became more frequent. Clara's hand on Harlan's shoulder as she passed behind his chair, Harlan steadying Clara when she stumbled on uneven ground, their fingers brushing as they both reached for the same dish. They caught each other's eyes more often, held the gaze a beat longer than necessary. The careful distance they'd maintained was slowly closing, like a gap being bridged inch by careful inch. It was nearly 3 weeks after the wedding when the first real test of their new family came in the form of a visitor. Harlan was mending fence in the south pasture when he saw a wagon approaching on the main road, and something about it made his instincts prickle with warning. As it drew closer, he recognized the driver, Silas Fletcher, a rancher from the next county over who'd served in the same regiment as Harlan during the war. They hadn't been friends exactly, but they'd shared the bond of survival, of having seen the same horrors and come out the other side. Fletcher was a hard man, made harder by the war, and Harlan had heard rumors about how he ran his ranch, with iron discipline and no tolerance for weakness. "Gage," Fletcher called as he pulled the wagon to a stop. "Heard you went and got yourself hitched. Thought I'd come see if the rumors were true." "They're true," Harlan said carefully, setting down his tools. Fletcher climbed down from the wagon, moving with the stiffness of old injuries. He'd taken a mini ball to the hip during the siege of Vicksburg, and it had never healed quite right. "Heard you married some widow who showed up on your doorstep with a kid. That true too?" "Clara's a good woman. Annie's a fine girl." "I'm sure they are," Fletcher said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But I'm surprised at you, Harlan. Always figured you for smarter than to let yourself get trapped by a woman with nothing but a sob story and pretty eyes." Harlan felt anger flare hot in his chest. "Watch what you say about my wife, Silas." Fletcher held up his hands in mock surrender. "No offense meant, just seems convenient is all. Woman and kid show up desperate, and suddenly you're married and supporting them. Makes a man wonder about motivations." "The only motivation that matters is that they needed help and I could provide it." "Could provide it," Fletcher repeated. "That's an interesting way to put it. Tell me, Gage, have you thought about what supporting a wife and child is going to cost you? Extra mouths to feed? Extra expenses? That ranch of yours does well enough for one man, But a family? That's different. We're managing fine. For now, maybe. But winter's coming. Times get hard. Money gets tight. Fletcher pulled a folded paper from his pocket. Which is why I wanted to talk to you. I'm buying up land in this area, consolidating properties. I'd like to make you an offer for your place. Harlan stared at him. This ranch isn't for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price, and I'm prepared to be generous, enough that you could relocate somewhere cheaper, set yourself up comfortable, might even have enough left over to send that little girl to a proper school back east. No, don't be hasty, Fletcher said. Think about what's best for your new family. Wouldn't your wife rather live in town, have neighbors, have an easier life than what a ranch can offer? Clara's happy here, Harlan said, though he suddenly wondered if that was true. Had he ever asked her? Or had he just assumed that because she hadn't complained, she was content? Fletcher studied him with the shrewd eyes of a man who'd learned to read people in order to survive. Look, I'll be straight with you. I want this land. It's good grazing, good water rights. I'm willing to pay fair price, but I will have it one way or another. Easier for everyone if we do this friendly-like. That sounds like a threat, Silas. It's a reality. I've bought out 5 ranchers in this county already. Some sold willingly, some needed more convincing, but they all sold in the end. Fletcher's voice hardened. Thing is, Harlan, men with families have more to lose than men who are alone. They have vulnerabilities, responsibilities. Makes them more reasonable. Harlan took a step forward, his fists clenching. If you're suggesting what I think you're suggesting... I'm not suggesting anything, Fletcher said quickly, though his eyes glinted with satisfaction at having gotten a rise out of Harlan. Just making an observation. Now, I'll leave this offer with you. Think it over, talk to your wife. I'll come back in a week for your answer. He tossed the folded paper at Harlan's feet and climbed back into his wagon. As he drove away, he called back, Give my regards to Mrs. Gage, and Harlan, think real careful about this. For their sake, if not your own. Harlan stood watching the wagon disappear, his heart pounding with anger and something darker, fear. Because Fletcher was right about one thing. Having a family did make him vulnerable, made him have something to lose beyond his own life. And men like Fletcher knew exactly how to exploit that vulnerability. He picked up the paper Fletcher had dropped and shoved it in his pocket without reading it. Then he gathered his tools and headed back to the house, his mind churning. Clara was in the kitchen when he entered, kneading bread dough with flour dusting her arms. She looked up at his expression and immediately set aside her work. What's wrong? She asked. Harlan told her about Fletcher's visit, about the offer, and the thinly veiled threats. As he spoke, he watched Clara's face go from concern to frightened to angry. He can't force you to sell, she said when he finished. Can he? Not legally, no. But there are other ways to make someone's life difficult, especially out here, where the nearest law is an hour away and neighbors look out for their own interests first. Clara sat down heavily in a chair, her hands trembling. This is my fault. If you hadn't married me, if you didn't have us to worry about, you could tell him to go to hell and not think twice about it. This has nothing to do with you, Harlan said firmly. Fletcher's been buying up land for months. He would have come after my ranch regardless. But he wouldn't have leverage, Clara said quietly. That's what I am now, isn't it? Leverage. A vulnerability. Something that can be used against you. Harlan crossed the kitchen and knelt in front of her chair, taking her flour-dusted hands in his. Listen to me. You are not a vulnerability. You're not leverage. You're my wife, and this is your home, and no one, not Fletcher, not anyone, is going to take that away from us. How can you promise that? Because I've faced worse than Silas Fletcher and survived, and because this time I have something worth fighting for. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Clara's eyes searched his face, and whatever she saw there made her lean forward and press her forehead to his. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I, Harlan admitted. But we'll figure this out together. That's what families do, right? Before Clara could respond, Annie burst through the door, her face flushed with excitement. Harlan, come quick! There's a mama cat in the barn with kittens, 4 of them, and they're so tiny. The moment of intensity between Harlan and Clara broke, and they both turned to look at Annie's enthusiastic face. Despite the tension of Fletcher's visit, despite the fear and uncertainty, Harlan found himself smiling. Show me, he said, standing and offering Clara his hand to help her up. They followed Annie to the barn, where she'd indeed discovered a stray cat that had made a nest in the hayloft. The tiny kittens were barely a week old, eyes still closed, mewing softly as they nursed. Annie was vibrating with barely contained excitement. "Can we keep them?" she asked. "Please, the mama looks hungry and they need somewhere safe." Harlan looked at the ragged cat, clearly half-starved, who'd nevertheless managed to keep her babies alive. He thought about Clara and Annie showing up at his fence, desperate and afraid, trusting him to help when they had nowhere else to turn. "We can keep them," he said, "but you'll be responsible for feeding them and making sure they have what they need." "I will," Annie promised. "I'll take such good care of them. You'll see." As they walked back to the house, Annie chattering about names for the kittens, Clara slipped her hand into Harlan's. It was a small gesture, casual enough that Annie wouldn't think twice about it, but it felt monumental to Harlan. It felt like trust, like partnership, like they were becoming something real instead of just a legal arrangement. That night, after Annie was in bed and they were having their usual coffee, Clara brought up Fletcher's offer again. "Have you thought about what he said?" she asked. "About it being harder to support a family than just yourself?" "I've thought about it," Harlan admitted. "But Clara, I'm not selling. This land, it's all I have left of my family. My father built this ranch from nothing. Thomas and I were supposed to work it together, build it into something bigger. Selling it would feel like giving up on all of that. Even if keeping it puts us in danger, I won't let Fletcher hurt you or Annie. I promise you that." Clara studied him over the rim of her coffee cup. "You can't promise that, Harlan. Not really. Men like Fletcher, they don't play fair, and if he decides he wants this land badly enough..." She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. "Then I'll fight," Harlan said simply. "I've fought before. I know how. That's what scares me. I don't want you to have to fight. I don't want Annie growing up in a place where violence is always lurking at the edges." Clara set down her cup, her hands trembling. "Maybe we should consider his offer. Maybe we should take the money and start fresh somewhere else, somewhere we could all be safe." Harlan felt something twist in his chest, hurt that she'd suggest leaving, fear that she wanted to, anger at Fletcher for putting them in this position. "Is that what you want? To leave?" "I want us to be safe," Clara said. "I want Annie to grow up happy and secure. I want..." She stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "I want to not lose this. Whatever we're building here, whatever this is becoming, and I'm afraid that if we stay, if we fight, we'll lose it anyway." "Or we'll fight and win," Harlan countered. "Or we'll fight and lose, but at least know we tried." "Clara, I'm not going to make decisions out of fear. That's not living. It's just surviving. And I'm done with just surviving." Clara looked at him for a long moment, her eyes reflecting the lamplight and something deeper, respect, maybe, or understanding. "All right," she said finally. "Then we stay. We fight if we have to. But Harlan, promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you'll be careful, that you won't take unnecessary risks, because you're not alone anymore. What happens to you happens to all of us." The weight of that responsibility should have felt crushing, but instead Harlan found it oddly grounding. He had people depending on him, yes, but he also had people to depend on. He wasn't carrying everything alone anymore. "I promise," he said. They finished their coffee in comfortable silence, and when they stood to retire for the night, Claire surprised him by standing on tiptoe and pressing a brief kiss to his cheek. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not making me feel foolish for being afraid." Before Harlan could respond, she'd slipped away to her room, leaving him standing in the kitchen with his hand pressed to the spot where her lips had touched, his heart doing something complicated and unfamiliar in his chest. Over the next few days, Harlan found himself hyper-aware of potential threats. Every unfamiliar rider on the road made him tense. Every unexpected noise at night had him reaching for the rifle he now kept closer at hand. He tried not to let Clara and Annie see his vigilance, but Clara was too observant to miss it entirely. "You're worried," she said one morning as she caught him scanning the horizon for the third time in an hour. "Just being careful." "There's a difference between careful and consumed," Clara said gently. "Harlan, we can't live in fear. That's not any kind of life, especially not for Annie." She was right, and Harlan knew it, but knowing it and acting on it were two different things. He'd spent too long in war, where constant vigilance meant survival, to easily shake the habit now that threat had returned to his life. The week passed slowly, each day dragging toward Fletcher's promised return visit. Harlan threw himself into work, pushing harder than necessary, as if exhausting his body might quiet his mind. Clara and Annie maintained their routines. Clara with determined cheerfulness, and Annie with the obliviousness of childhood. They were trying to keep things normal, and Harlan loved them for it, even as he couldn't fully shake his tension. When Fletcher's wagon appeared on the horizon exactly 1 week after his first visit, Harlan was ready. He'd spent the previous evening cleaning and loading his rifle, not because he planned to use it, but because he wanted Fletcher to know he was prepared to if necessary. He met Fletcher at the property line, making it clear the man wouldn't be welcome any closer to his house. "Gage," Fletcher said by way of greeting, "I'm here for your answer." "The answer's no," Harlan said flatly. "This ranch isn't for sale, and it won't be for sale next week or next month or next year, so you can stop making offers and move on to harassing someone else." Fletcher's expression hardened. "That's disappointing. I'd hoped you'd be more reasonable." "I'm being perfectly reasonable. You're the one who can't take no for an answer. You're making a mistake, Gage, a mistake that's going to cost you." "Is that another threat, Silas?" "It's a fact." Fletcher leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping. "You think you're tough because you survived the war? So did I. So did a lot of men who are now working for me, men who understand that sometimes you have to fight for what you want. And I want this land." Harlan's hand moved casually to rest on the rifle at his side. "Then you're going to be disappointed, because this land is mine, legally and rightfully, and I will defend it and my family with everything I have. Do we understand each other?" For a long moment, they stared at each other, two men who'd seen war and knew exactly what they were threatening. Then Fletcher smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We understand each other perfectly," he said. "I'll be seeing you around, Gage, you and your family." He turned his wagon and rode away, and Harlan stood watching until he was out of sight, his hand still on his rifle, his heart pounding with anger and fear and determination. When he returned to the house, he found Clara waiting on the porch, Annie playing with the kittens nearby. Clara took one look at his face and understood immediately what had happened. "He didn't accept your refusal," she said. "No." "So what do we do now?" Harlan looked at his wife, at the child who'd become like a daughter to him, at the home they'd built together over these few short weeks. He thought about Fletcher's threats and his own promises, about what was worth fighting for, and what it meant to truly live instead of just survive. "Now," he said, "we live our lives. We don't hide, we don't run, we don't let fear control us. We work the ranch, we raise Annie, we build something good here. And if Fletcher or anyone else tries to take that away from us, we fight back. Together." Clara nodded slowly, then reached out and took his hand. "Together," she agreed. And standing there on his porch with his wife's hand in his and the sound of Annie's laughter in the air, Harlan felt something settle in his chest. Not peace exactly, there was too much uncertainty for that, but purpose, resolve, the bone-deep knowledge that whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. He'd spent 6 years running from connection, from vulnerability, from the risk of caring, but now, faced with the possibility of losing everything he'd gained, Harlan understood that the risk was worth it. That loving people and being loved in return was worth fighting for, worth defending, worth whatever price Fletcher or fate or life itself might demand. He was done running, done hiding, done surviving. It was time to live, whatever that might cost him. The days following Fletcher's second visit carried a weight that pressed against everything they did, like humidity before a storm that refuses to break. Harlan worked the ranch with one eye always scanning the horizon, his rifle never far from reach. Clara went about her household tasks with a determined normalcy that was more defiant than peaceful, refusing to let Fletcher's threats steal the life they were building. And Annie, blessedly unaware of the adult tension swirling around her, continued to grow and bloom like the wildflowers she loved to pick. It was Annie who first noticed the fence damage 3 days after Fletcher's visit. She came running to find Harlan in the south pasture, her face flushed with exertion and concern. "Harlan," she called, stumbling over rocks in her haste. "The fence by the creek. It's all broken down, and some of the cattle got out." Harlan's jaw tightened. He'd checked that fence 2 days ago, and it had been solid. This was no accident. He followed Annie to the creek and found exactly what he'd expected. Fence posts deliberately pulled up, wire cut cleanly with tools, and half a dozen head of cattle wandering loose on the wrong side of his property line. "Stay here," he told Annie. "I need to round up the cattle." "I can help," she insisted. "I know how to herd them. You showed me." Harlan wanted to refuse, wanted to keep her away from anything connected to Fletcher's sabotage, but they needed to get the cattle back quickly before they wandered too far or onto another rancher's land. So he nodded, and together they spent the next 2 hours driving the animals back through the gap and into the pasture. By the time they'd finished and temporarily repaired the fence, the sun was setting and Harlan's anger had settled into something cold and hard. This was just the beginning, he knew. Fletcher would keep pushing, keep causing problems, until Harlan either sold or fought back in a way that would give Fletcher legal justification for retaliation. Clara took one look at his face when they returned and sent Annie to wash up for supper while she pulled Harlan aside. "It was Fletcher, wasn't it?" she said quietly. "No way to prove it, but yes." "What are we going to do?" Harlan looked at his wife, her face worried but determined, her hands clasped together to keep them from trembling, and made a decision. "Tomorrow, I'm riding into town. I need to talk to the sheriff, need to document what's happening even if we can't prove who's behind it. And I need to—" He paused, then continued, "I need to talk to some people. See if Fletcher's done this before, if there are others he's pushed out." "I'm coming with you," Clara said immediately. "Clara, no arguments, Harlan. If we're in this together, then we're in it together. Besides, Annie needs some new shoes, and I could use some supplies. We'll look like a normal family doing normal errands. No one needs to know you're investigating Fletcher." The word family sent a warmth through Harlan's chest despite the circumstances. "All right," he agreed. "We go together." That night, after Annie was asleep, Harlan found himself unable to settle. He stood on the porch watching the stars, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, when he heard the door open behind him. Clara emerged wrapped in a shawl, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, offering him a cup. "Too much thinking." Clara leaned against the porch railing beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "What are you thinking about?" "About how much easier this would be if I didn't have anything to lose," Harlan admitted. "When it was just me, I could take risks without worrying about consequences. Now every decision affects you and Annie, and I keep second-guessing myself." "That's called caring," Clara said softly. "It's supposed to be complicated." "I'm not good at complicated." "None of us are. We just do our best and hope it's enough." Clara turned to look at him, her face barely visible in the starlight. "Harlan, I need to tell you something about why we were really on that wagon train, about what happened after my husband died." Harlan felt her tension and set down his coffee cup to give her his full attention. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share." "I want to. I need you to know." Clara took a breath. "After William died and we lost the store and the house, I had 3 choices. I could go to my sisters and admit I'd failed, which my pride wouldn't let me do. I could accept one of those protection offers from men who saw a desperate widow as an opportunity, or I could find another way." She paused, and Harlan waited, sensing this was difficult for her. "I worked as a seamstress for a while, but it barely paid enough for a room and food. Then a woman approached me. Mrs. Holbrook, she called herself, though I doubt that was her real name. She ran a boarding house in Kansas City, but it wasn't really a boarding house. It was—" Clara's voice dropped. "It was a place where men came to find company, if you understand my meaning." Harlan understood, and his heart ached for what she must have endured. "She offered me work," Clara continued. "Said I could make enough in a month to get us to Oregon, to my sisters, to safety. And I was so desperate, so tired of watching Annie go hungry, that I almost said yes. I was packed and ready to leave Annie with a neighbor for the night, ready to do whatever it took to survive." "But you didn't," Harlan said quietly. "But I didn't. Because Annie looked at me that night and said, 'Mama, you always tell me we're respectable. What does that mean?' And I realized that if I went to Mrs. Holbrook's, I could never again look my daughter in the eye and tell her we were respectable. I could never teach her to value herself if I didn't value myself. Claire's voice broke. So I took the money I'd saved for boarding house rent, bought passage on the wagon train instead, and told myself we'd make it somehow, that God or fate or whatever force governs this world would provide a way. And then the wagon master abandoned you. And then you found us. Clara turned to face him fully now. Don't you see, Harlan? You weren't just shelter from a storm. You were the answer to a prayer I was too proud to admit I was praying. You gave me back my dignity, my hope, my ability to believe that good things could still happen. Harlan felt something swell in his chest, too big and complex to name. Clara. So when you worry about whether you're making the right decisions, whether you're doing enough, Clara interrupted, I need you to know that you've already done more than enough. You've given us everything that matters, and whatever happens with Fletcher or anything else, we'll face it together, not because we have to, but because we choose to. Before Harlan could talk himself out of it, before fear or doubt or old habits could stop him, he reached out and pulled Clara into his arms. She came willingly, her head tucking perfectly under his chin, her arms wrapping around his waist. They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other under the vast Kansas sky, and Harlan felt something settle in him that had been restless for 6 years. I'm glad you asked me to sweep my barn, he said against her hair, and felt rather than saw her smile. Best decision I ever made, she whispered back. When they finally separated, there was a new understanding between them. The marriage that had started as practicality was becoming something more, something real and chosen and worth protecting. They went to bed separately, as had been their habit, but something had shifted. The distance between them was closing, one honest conversation at a time. The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect for the ride into town. Annie was excited about the trip, chattering about what she hoped to see and whether the general store might have peppermint sticks. Clara had dressed in her best, determined to face the town gossips with her head high. And Harlan wore his father's pocket watch, a talisman of sorts, a reminder of the family who'd built this ranch and the family he was building now. Millbrook was busier than usual when they arrived, some kind of church social, bringing people in from surrounding farms. Harlan helped Clara and Annie down from the wagon, noticing how several townspeople turned to stare, their conversations pausing mid-sentence. He felt Clara stiffen beside him and took her hand deliberately, publicly, making it clear they were united. Hold your head up, he murmured to her. We have nothing to be ashamed of. Clara squeezed his hand gratefully and did exactly that, walking beside him with quiet dignity as they made their way to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Bradley looked up from his desk as they entered, his expression shifting from neutral to concerned when he saw Harlan's face. Tom, Harlan said, I need to report some property damage. Someone cut my fence by the creek. Let cattle loose. Bradley pulled out a notepad. When did this happen? Night before last, best I can figure. Found it yesterday morning. Harlan gave him the details, careful to stick to facts and not mention his suspicions about Fletcher. But Bradley was no fool. When Harlan finished, the sheriff set down his pencil and looked at him directly. This have anything to do with Silas Fletcher's interest in your property? Can't prove it does, but the timing's suspicious. Bradley sighed. Fletcher's been doing this all over the county. Fence damage, mysteriously spooked cattle, equipment going missing. Nothing we can pin on him directly, but it's always ranchers he's made offers to who experience the problems. And you can't stop him? Not without proof. And Fletcher's smart. He never gets his own hands dirty. Bradley leaned back in his chair. But I'll tell you what I told the others. Document everything. Write down dates, damages, costs. Build a paper trail. Eventually, he'll slip up or push too hard, and when he does, I'll have enough to bring charges. How many others? Clara asked. How many ranchers has he done this to? 5 that I know of. 3 sold and left the county. 2 are still holding out, but it's costing them. Bradley looked apologetic. I wish I could do more, Harlan, but my hands are tied without evidence. They left the sheriff's office more discouraged than when they'd arrived. Legal protection was useless if the law couldn't act, and Fletcher knew it. As they walked toward the general store, Harlan found himself scanning the street, looking for Fletcher or his men, on edge in a way that made him hate what this situation was turning him into. At the general store, Sam Tucker greeted them warmly, pointedly ignoring the disapproving looks from Mrs. Henderson and her circle of friends who were browsing fabrics in the corner. Annie immediately gravitated toward the candy jars, her eyes wide with longing, and Clara smiled despite the tension. "Pick one treat," she told Annie. "Just one." While Clara helped Annie make her selection and then looked at shoes, Harlan pulled Sam aside. "I need to ask you something. Those ranchers who sold to Fletcher, do any of them still live around here? Anyone I could talk to?" Sam's expression grew troubled. Most moved away, but Jim Morrison, no relation to the doctor, he's still in the county, lives in a small house on the edge of town. Sold his ranch to Fletcher last spring. He lowered his voice. Lost his barn in a fire 2 weeks before he sold. Never could prove it was arson, but Harlan understood. "Can you give me his address?" Sam wrote it down, then hesitated. "Harlan, be careful. Fletcher's got friends in this town, people who benefit from his business. Not everyone's going to be happy about you asking questions." "Noted." They finished their shopping and loaded the supplies into the wagon. Harlan told Clara he needed to make one more stop and drove to the address Sam had given him. Jim Morrison's house was small and shabby, the home of a man who'd lost everything. When Morrison answered the door, Harlan saw defeat written in every line of his weathered face. "Mr. Morrison, my name's Harlan Gage. I'm sorry to bother you, but I was hoping you could spare a few minutes to talk about Silas Fletcher." Morrison's face hardened. "You one of his men?" "No, sir. I'm someone he's trying to force off my land. I heard what happened to you, and I wanted to know the truth." Morrison studied Harlan for a long moment, then glanced past him to where Clara and Annie waited in the wagon. Something in his expression softened. "You got a family," he said. "That makes it harder." "Makes what harder?" "Saying no to him, standing your ground." Morrison stepped aside. "Come in. Your wife and daughter, too. This ain't a conversation to have in the street." In Morrison's sparse parlor, with Annie playing quietly with her new kitten toy in the corner, Morrison told them his story. It was a familiar pattern: Fletcher making an offer, Morrison refusing, then a series of escalating problems. Fence damage, like Harlan had experienced, then equipment sabotage. Then his prize horse turned up lame, and finally, the fire that destroyed his barn and killed 3 of his cattle. "Sheriff said he couldn't prove nothing," Morrison said bitterly. "But I know what I know. 2 days after the fire, Fletcher showed up with a new offer, lower than the first one since my property was worth less now. Said I could take it, or wait for things to get worse." He looked at his hands. "I had a wife and 2 young sons. I couldn't risk them getting hurt. So I sold." Clara's hand found Harlan's, squeezing tight. "Where are they now? Your family?" "Kansas City. I work in a factory there, save every penny I can. Someday, maybe I'll have enough to buy land again. Someday." But his voice held no conviction, and Harlan knew Morrison understood that someday would never come. "Did you ever see any of Fletcher's men?" Harlan asked. "Anyone you could identify?" "Saw shadows once or twice, heard horses in the night, but see them clear enough to testify in court? No." Morrison leaned forward. "Mr. Gage, I'm going to tell you what I wish someone had told me. Fletcher always wins. He's got money, connections, men willing to do his dirty work. And he's patient. He'll keep pushing until you break or sell or—" He glanced at Clara and Annie. "Until something happens that makes you realize no piece of land is worth losing what really matters." "That's exactly what he's counting on," Harlan said quietly. "That we'll all be too afraid to stand up to him." "Sometimes fear is smart," Morrison said. "Sometimes it keeps you alive." They thanked Morrison for his time and left, the weight of his words settling heavy on all of them. On the ride home, Annie fell asleep against Clara's shoulder, exhausted from the excitement of town. Clara and Harlan rode in silence, each lost in thought. Finally, Clara spoke. "He's right, you know, Morrison. No land is worth losing your family over." "I'm not going to lose you," Harlan said. "You can't promise that." "Yes, I can, because I'm not going to let Fletcher dictate how we live. I'm not going to let him win through intimidation." Harlan looked at Clara, at the fear in her eyes that she was trying so hard to hide. "But I need to know you're with me, that you believe this fight is worth having." Clara was quiet for so long that Harlan thought she might not answer. Then she said, "When I left Kansas City, when I chose to keep my dignity rather than take the easy path, I promised myself I'd never again let desperation make my decisions. If we run from Fletcher, if we let him drive us away, that's desperation talking. But if we stay, if we fight for what's ours," she took a breath. "That's choosing. That's living deliberately. So yes, I'm with you. We stand our ground." Harlan felt something fierce and proud swell in his chest. This woman, who'd been through so much, who had every reason to choose safety over principle, was choosing to fight beside him. It humbled him and strengthened him at the same time. When they arrived home, Harlan carried a sleepy Annie into the house while Clara unpacked the supplies. After Annie was tucked into bed, they stood together in the kitchen, the lamp casting warm shadows across the familiar space. "What's our next move?" Clara asked. "We prepare," Harlan said. "Make sure the ranch is secure, document everything that happens, and let Fletcher know we're not going anywhere." He paused. "And we live our lives. We don't let him steal our joy or our peace, because the moment we do that, he's already won." Over the next week, Harlan worked harder than ever to secure the ranch. He repaired fences, marked property boundaries clearly, and set up a system where he could check the perimeter every morning and evening. He also did something he hadn't done since the war. He asked for help. His nearest neighbor, a Norwegian farmer named Eric Hansen, had always been friendly in a distant way. When Harlan rode over to explain the situation with Fletcher, Hansen listened thoughtfully and then said, "I wondered when Fletcher would work his way to your property. He tried to buy mine last year." "What did you do?" "I told him to go to hell in 3 languages, Hansen said with a slight smile. "Norwegian, English, and one I learned in the army that's not fit for polite company. He hasn't bothered me since, but I watch my back." He extended his hand. "You need help. You send word. We neighbors should look out for each other." The conversation with Hansen led to others. Harlan discovered that several ranchers in the area had dealt with Fletcher's pressure and resented it. They might not be willing to testify against him, but they were willing to keep watch, to share information, to present a united front that made further intimidation more difficult. It was during this time that Harlan saw Clara truly take ownership of their home. She organized a dinner for the neighboring families who'd pledged support, cooking enough food to feed a small army, and charming everyone with her warmth and grace. She befriended their wives, creating a network of women who looked out for each other and shared news. And she did it all with a quiet strength that made Harlan fall a little more in love with her every day. Love. The word crept into his thoughts more and more often, at first unwelcome and then inevitable. He loved the way Clara hummed while she cooked. He loved how she'd started leaving little notes for him around the house, reminders of tasks, or sometimes just simple messages like, "Thinking of you." He loved the sound of her laugh, the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention, the competent way she handled everything from a household emergency to a difficult conversation. And Annie had completely captured his heart. She was his shadow, his student, his source of unexpected joy. When she called him Harlan in that matter-of-fact way of hers, when she took his hand without thinking, when she ran to him with her problems and triumphs, Harlan felt a fierce protective love that he'd never experienced before. 2 weeks after their trip to town, on an evening when the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Harlan came in from the fields to find Clara and Annie in the garden. Clara was teaching Annie to identify different plants, their heads bent together over a basil plant, and the sight of them, his wife and daughter in all but blood, made something crystallize in Harlan's mind. This was what he'd been fighting for, not just the land or the ranch, or even his pride. This moment of peace and beauty and belonging, this family that had somehow formed from desperation and kindness and daily choice. That night, after Annie was asleep, Harlan found Clara on the porch, where they'd shared so many evening conversations. She smiled as he joined her, and he thought she'd never looked more beautiful than she did in that moment, backlit by lamplight and starshine. "Clara," he said, "I need to tell you something." She turned to face him, suddenly serious. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's—" He struggled for words. This man who'd spent 6 years in silence. "When you and Annie showed up at my fence, I thought I was doing you a favor. I thought I was helping you, but the truth is, You saved me. You brought me back to life. You made me remember what it means to care about something beyond the next day's work." Clara's eyes were shining in the darkness. "Harlan, let me finish," he said gently. "I know this marriage started as a practical arrangement, protection and security in exchange for a home. But Clara, it's become so much more than that, at least for me. And I need you to know that I love you. I love you and Annie both, and not because I have to or because it's my duty, but because I choose to. Because you've become the center of my world, and I can't imagine it any other way." A tear slipped down Clara's cheek, catching the light. "Do you mean that? Truly?" "I've never meant anything more in my life." Clara stepped closer, her hands coming up to frame his face. "Then you should know that I love you too. I have for weeks now, maybe from the moment you stood up to Mrs. Henderson in that store. You're everything I didn't know I needed, strong and kind and stubborn and good. And I stopped thinking of this as a convenient arrangement a long time ago." Harlan kissed her then, really kissed her, not the brief press of lips from their wedding day, but a deep, claiming kiss that spoke of promises and passion and permanence. Clara kissed him back with equal fervor, her fingers threading through his hair, her body melting against his. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Harlan rested his forehead against hers. "I want to be a real husband to you, Clara, in every way, if you're willing." "I'm willing," she whispered. "I've been willing for a while now. I was just waiting for you to be ready." That night, the distance between their bedrooms finally closed. Harlan carried Clara to his room, their room now, and showed her with touch and whispered words exactly how much she meant to him. And Clara gave herself to him with trust and love and a joy that made Harlan understand finally what it meant to be truly alive. In the weeks that followed, their life took on a new dimension. The quiet contentment they'd built expanded into something richer and deeper. A partnership that encompassed every aspect of their lives. They worked together during the day and fell asleep in each other's arms at night. They made plans for the future, expanding the ranch, perhaps adding to their family, building something lasting. Annie noticed the change, of course. Children always did. But if she had questions about why her mother now slept in Harlan's room or why they seemed to smile at each other more, she kept them to herself. She seemed simply happy that the adults in her life were happy, that the home they'd built together felt secure and permanent. Fletcher, meanwhile, had been surprisingly quiet. No more fence damage, no more mysterious problems. It made Harlan nervous at first, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But as summer turned toward autumn and the quiet continued, he began to wonder if perhaps their resistance had worked. If perhaps Fletcher had moved on to easier targets. He should have known better. It was late September when Annie found the dead cattle. She'd gone out early to check on the mama cat and her now-grown kittens in the barn and had wandered to the north pasture. Harlan heard her screaming and ran, his heart in his throat, expecting to find her hurt. Instead, he found her standing frozen at the pasture gate, her face white with shock. Beyond her, 4 head of cattle lay dead, clearly poisoned, and on the fence post was a note, simple and direct. "Final offer, $2,000 for the property, or next time it's worse. You have 1 week." Harlan read the note with cold fury spreading through his veins. This was beyond property damage or intimidation. This was a direct threat, and the implication was clear. If cattle could be poisoned, so could people. He scooped up Annie, who was shaking and crying, and carried her back to the house. Clara took one look at their faces and knew something terrible had happened. While she comforted Annie, Harlan rode directly to town to fetch Sheriff Bradley. Bradley examined the scene, photographed the note, took statements. His face was grim as he finished his documentation. "This crosses a line," he said. "Poisoning livestock is a serious crime, and the note is direct evidence. I can arrest Fletcher." "Will it stick?" Harlan asked. Bradley's expression said everything. "Not unless we can prove he wrote the note or ordered it written, and he's too smart for that. His lawyer will have him out before the ink dries on the charges." "So what do we do?" "I'll bring him in for questioning, see if I can rattle him into saying something useful. But Harlan," Bradley's voice dropped. "He's escalating. The man's not going to stop. You need to think seriously about whether this land is worth what he's threatening." "It's not just land anymore," Harlan said quietly. "It's principle. If we give in to him, what message does that send? That bullies win? That might makes right? I can't teach Annie that. I won't. Bradley nodded slowly. Then you'd better be prepared for this to get ugly. And Harlan, keep your family close. Don't let them out of your sight. The next few days were tense. Fletcher was indeed arrested and indeed released within hours, his expensive lawyer citing lack of evidence connecting him to the note or the poisoning. But something had shifted. The gloves were off now, the pretense of civilized business dealings abandoned. Harlan kept Clara and Annie close to the house. He slept lightly, his rifle always within reach. And he waited for Fletcher's next move, knowing it would come, but not knowing what form it would take. The answer came on a Thursday evening. Harlan was doing evening chores when he smelled smoke. His heart stopped, and he ran toward the barn, expecting to find it aflame like Morrison's had been. But the barn was fine. The smoke was coming from the direction of Hanson's property. He found Clara already running toward him. "Hanson's house," she said breathlessly. "I saw the smoke. Harlan, they're escalating. They're—" "Stay here," Harlan commanded. "Lock the doors. Keep Annie inside. I'm going to help Hanson." "Be careful," Clara said, grabbing his arm. "Please, Harlan, come back to us." He kissed her quickly, fiercely. Always. By the time Harlan reached Hanson's property, half the county seemed to be there, neighbors with buckets forming a line from the well to the burning house. Hanson was shouting orders, his face blackened with soot, his eyes wild with fury and fear. "My wife was inside," he kept saying. "Anna was inside." Harlan's blood ran cold. Without thinking, he grabbed a wet blanket someone thrust at him and ran toward the burning house. He could hear shouting behind him, people yelling for him to stop, but he ignored them. If there was even a chance Anna Hanson was alive in there, he had to try. The heat was overwhelming, smoke thick enough to choke on. Harlan dropped low, using the wet blanket to protect his head and face, calling Anna's name. He found her in what must have been the kitchen, collapsed on the floor but still breathing. He wrapped her in the blanket and half-carried, half-dragged her out of the burning building. They'd barely cleared the door when part of the roof collapsed behind them, sending up a shower of sparks and flame. Harlan's lungs burned, his eyes streamed, but Anna was alive. He laid her on the ground away from the fire, and Dr. Morrison immediately took over, checking her breathing and pulse. "She'll live," Morrison said after a tense examination. "Smoke inhalation, some burns, but she'll live. Harlan, you probably saved her life." Harlan nodded, unable to speak through his raw throat. He looked up to find Eric Hansen standing over him, tears cutting tracks through the soot on his face. "My home is gone," Hansen said hoarsely. "But my Anna lives. Thank you. Thank you." Around them, neighbors were still fighting the fire, though it was clearly a lost cause. The house would burn to the foundation, but everyone understood what this really was. A message from Fletcher. A demonstration of what he was willing to do. Sheriff Bradley arrived as the fire was finally dying down, his face grave as he surveyed the damage. "Eric, did you see anything? Anyone suspicious before the fire started?" "3 riders," Hansen said. "Saw them in the distance maybe an hour before I smelled smoke. Too far away to identify, but I know what I know. This was Fletcher." "Can you prove it?" Hansen's silence was answer enough. Bradley pulled Harlan aside. "This has gone too far. I'm going to Fletcher's ranch tonight, and I'm bringing every deputy I can muster. Even if we can't make charges stick, I'm going to make it damn clear that the law is watching him now." "I'm coming with you," Harlan said. "Harlan, I'm coming. This isn't just about my ranch anymore. He's terrorizing the whole county. Someone needs to stand up to him, and if the law can't do it effectively, then the people he's wronged should at least have their say." Bradley considered, then nodded. "All right, but you follow my lead. We do this by the book, or we risk making things worse." Harlan rode home quickly to tell Clara what had happened and where he was going. She listened with growing horror to the story of the fire, then threw her arms around him. "You could have died," she said against his chest. "But I didn't, and Anna Hansen is alive because of it." Clara pulled back to look at him. "Go with the sheriff. Do what needs to be done. But Harlan, promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll come home." "I promise." He kissed her long and deep, kissed Annie goodbye where she slept peacefully, unaware of the night's drama, and rode back to join Bradley and a group of deputies and concerned citizens who'd volunteered to accompany them to Fletcher's ranch. Fletcher's spread was impressive: a large house, multiple barns, extensive corrals. Everything Morrison and the others had lost, Fletcher had gained. The irony wasn't lost on Harlan as they rode up the long drive, the thunder of their horses' hooves announcing their arrival. Fletcher emerged onto his porch, flanked by several rough-looking men who were clearly hired guns. He showed no surprise at their arrival, only a kind of amused contempt. "Sheriff Bradley," he said smoothly, "to what do I owe this late-night visit?" "Eric Hansen's house burned tonight," Bradley said without preamble. "His wife nearly died. 3 riders were seen in the area just before the fire started." "Terrible tragedy," Fletcher said, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "I hope Mrs. Hansen recovers quickly, but I fail to see what this has to do with me." "Cut the act, Fletcher," Harlan said, unable to contain himself. "Everyone here knows what you're doing. The sabotage, the threats, now arson. How many people have to suffer before you're satisfied?" Fletcher's eyes found Harlan, and his smile grew colder. "Mr. Gage, still clinging to that little ranch of yours, I see. How's the family? Wife and daughter doing well?" The implied threat made Harlan's vision go red. He started forward, but Bradley's hand on his arm stopped him. "That sounded like a threat, Mr. Fletcher," Bradley said quietly, "and that's something I can arrest you for." "Did it?" Fletcher's expression was all innocence. "I was merely asking after Mr. Gage's family. Surely that's not a crime." "The crimes you've committed?" Bradley started. "Alleged crimes," Fletcher interrupted, "which you have no proof of. Now, unless you have a warrant, Sheriff, I'd appreciate if you and your mob would leave my property." Bradley's jaw worked, but he knew when he was beaten. Without hard evidence, there was nothing more he could do. "This isn't over, Fletcher." "No," Fletcher agreed, his eyes still on Harlan. "It's not. Mr. Gage still has until Monday to accept my final offer. After that," he shrugged. "Well, who knows what might happen? Accidents are so common on ranches. People get hurt, buildings burn, families get torn apart by tragedy." Harlan lunged forward, but it took 3 men to hold him back. Fletcher just smiled, having gotten the reaction he wanted. "Monday, Gage," he called as they were forced to leave. "Think about what matters most to you." The ride back was silent, each man lost in thoughts of anger and frustration. When they reached town, Bradley pulled Harlan aside one more time. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know this isn't the outcome anyone wanted, but Harlan, you need to think seriously about his offer. A man like Fletcher doesn't make idle threats." "I know he doesn't," Harlan said quietly, "but I'm done running from bullies, done letting fear make my decisions." He rode home through the pre-dawn darkness, his mind churning. Fletcher had made his threat clear. Accept the offer, or watch everyone Harlan loved suffer. It was the choice Morrison had faced, the choice that had broken him. But as Harlan's house came into view, lamplight glowing in the windows where Clara had stayed awake waiting for him, he knew he couldn't make the same choice Morrison had. Not because the land mattered more than his family, it didn't, but because teaching Annie and Clara to run from threats, to let bullies win, to compromise their principles out of fear, that would destroy them just as surely as any fire Fletcher could set. Clara met him at the door, and he held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid reality of her in his arms. "What happened?" she asked. He told her everything: the confrontation, Fletcher's threats, the deadline. When he finished, Clara was quiet for a long moment. "Monday," she said finally. 3 days. 3 days. "What are we going to do?" Harlan pulled back to look at her. "What do you think we should do?" Clara took a deep breath. "I think we should call his bluff. I think we should refuse to sell, document everything he does in response, and trust that eventually justice will catch up with him. It's a risk, Harlan, a huge risk. But if we give in now, we'll spend the rest of our lives running from one bully or another, and I'm tired of running." Harlan felt his love for this woman swell until it felt like his chest couldn't contain it. "You're sure? Because this is your home too now, your safety and Annie's. I won't make this decision without you." "I'm sure," Clara said firmly. "We stand our ground, together." The next 3 days were some of the longest of Harlan's life. They prepared as best they could, moved valuable items to Hansen's temporary shelter, made sure all animals were accounted for, kept weapons close at hand. The neighboring ranchers, inspired by Harlan's defiance and angered by the attack on Hansen, formed a kind of informal patrol, taking turns watching each other's properties. Annie sensed the tension but didn't fully understand it. She went about her routines with the resilience of childhood, playing with her kittens, helping with chores, asking questions about everything. It broke Harlan's heart to see her innocence, knowing Fletcher's threats put her in danger. Sunday evening came, their last night before Fletcher's deadline. After Annie was asleep, Harlan and Clara sat together on the porch, holding hands and watching the stars. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Harlan said, "I want you to know that these past months with you and Annie have been the best of my life. You made me whole again, made me remember what it means to be human." "Don't talk like you're saying goodbye," Clara said fiercely. "We're going to get through this. We're going to wake up Tuesday morning in our home with our daughter and our life intact. I believe that, Harlan. I have to believe it." "I believe it too," Harlan said, and found that he meant it. Not because he had any guarantee of safety, but because the alternative, letting fear win, letting Fletcher destroy what they'd built, was unthinkable. Monday dawned bright and clear, a mockery of the tension hanging over them. Harlan did his morning chores with meticulous care, checking fences, accounting for animals, looking for any sign of Fletcher's promised retaliation. But the morning passed quietly, then the afternoon, then evening began to fall with no sign of trouble. "Maybe he was bluffing," Clara said as they sat down to dinner. "Maybe," Harlan agreed, though he didn't believe it. They were finishing their meal when they heard horses approaching, not the thunder of a raiding party, but the measured clip-clop of a small group. Harlan grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch, Claire behind him with Annie clutched close. It was Sheriff Bradley, accompanied by a well-dressed stranger and 3 deputies. Bradley's face was unreadable as he dismounted. "Harlan, Clara, can we come in?" Harlan's heart sank. This felt like bad news, but he nodded and led them into the parlor where Clara perched on the edge of the sofa with Annie beside her, both looking anxious. "Mr. Gage," the stranger said, "my name is William Peterson. I'm a federal marshal and I've been investigating Silas Fletcher for the past 6 months. Harlan felt his heartbeat quicken. Investigating him for what? Mail fraud, intimidation, conspiracy to commit arson, and suspected murder, Peterson said calmly. Fletcher's been operating across multiple counties, using the same tactics everywhere. But victims have been too frightened to testify, and we couldn't build a case. Until now. "I don't understand," Clara said. "What changed?" Peterson pulled out a folder. "What changed is that one of Fletcher's men got scared. Carl Dunmore. He was there the night the Hansen house burned. Fletcher ordered it, and Dunmore lit the fire. But when he saw Mrs. Hansen almost die, it was too much for him. He came to us, gave a full confession, agreed to testify against Fletcher in exchange for a reduced sentence." Harlan felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. "So, Fletcher is under arrest," Bradley said, unable to hide his satisfaction. "We picked him up an hour ago. He's being held without bail pending trial. And with Dunmore's testimony, plus the evidence we've gathered from other victims, the prosecutor is confident we can convict him on multiple charges." Clara let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Annie looked confused, but hopeful. And Harlan felt 6 weeks of tension drain out of him all at once, leaving him almost dizzy with relief. "It's over?" he asked, needing to hear it confirmed. "It's over," Peterson said. "Fletcher's done terrorizing people. And Mr. Gage, I want you to know that your refusal to back down, your willingness to stand up to him even when it was dangerous, that inspired other victims to come forward. Jim Morrison is willing to testify now. So are 2 others. You helped break this case by refusing to be broken yourself." After the lawmen left, Clara threw herself into Harlan's arms, laughing and crying at the same time. Annie, picking up on the adults' relief, started dancing around the room, and Harlan found himself laughing for the first time in weeks. "It's really over," Clara said against his chest. "We won. We actually won." "We stood our ground," Harlan corrected. "We refused to let fear win. That's what matters." That night, after Annie was asleep and they lay in their bed together, Clara turned to Harlan in the darkness. Do you remember that first night? She asked. When Annie asked if she could sweep your barn in exchange for letting us sleep there? I remember. I was so scared, so desperate. I truly believed we might die on that road if you turned us away. She moved closer, her hand finding his. I could never have imagined then that 3 months later we'd be here. Married, in love, safe. It seemed impossible. Most good things seem impossible until they happen, Harlan said. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd said no? If you'd turned us away? I try not to think about it, Harlan admitted, because the idea of a world where I never met you, where Annie never entered my life, where I'm still alone in this house going through the motions of living without actually being alive, that's more terrifying than anything Fletcher threatened. Clara kissed him then, soft and sweet. Sometimes I think we weren't just looking for shelter that day. We were looking for a place to belong. And you weren't just offering shelter. You were looking for a reason to belong to the world again. Guess we found what we were looking for, Harlan said. Guess we built it ourselves, Clara corrected. The weeks following Fletcher's arrest brought a sense of peace to the county that hadn't existed in years. Ranchers who'd been driven out started coming back, reclaiming properties Fletcher had bought through intimidation. Jim Morrison and his family returned, and Harlan helped him rebuild. The neighbors who'd banded together during the crisis became genuine friends, their families gathering regularly for shared meals and support. As autumn deepened into winter, Harlan's ranch thrived in ways it never had when he'd worked it alone. Claire's garden produced enough vegetables to preserve for winter and share with neighbors. Annie started attending the small local school, making friends and thriving under the security of a stable home. And Harlan discovered that the ranch work that had once been a way to avoid thinking was now a joy, because it was building something for people he loved. On a crisp November evening, with the first snow of winter dusting the ground, Harlan stood on his porch watching Clara and Annie build a snowman in the yard. Their laughter rang out clear and bright, and Harlan felt a peace he'd never thought he'd experience again. Mr. Gage? He turned to find Annie at the bottom of the porch steps, her nose red from the cold, her eyes bright with happiness. What is it, sweetheart? Mama and I were talking, and we wanted to ask you something. She climbed the steps to stand beside him. You know how Mama's name changed when you got married? She's Mrs. Gage now instead of Mrs. Wells? I know. Well, I'm still Annie Wells, and I was wondering... She looked up at him with that same brave expression she'd worn that first day at his fence. Would it be all right if I was Annie Gage instead? If I called you Papa instead of Harlan? Mama said I should ask, that it was a big thing and you might need time to think about it. Harlan felt his throat close up, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. He knelt down so he was at Annie's eye level, taking her small, cold hands in his larger, warm ones. Annie, he said, his voice rough, I would be honored to be your papa, more honored than I can say. You've been my daughter in every way that matters since the day you asked me about sweeping the barn. The name is just making it official. Annie's face split into a smile so bright it rivaled the sun. She threw her arms around his neck, and Harlan held her close, this child who'd somehow become his, marveling at how a desperate question asked on a summer afternoon had led to this moment of perfect belonging. Clara joined them on the porch, her eyes shining with tears of joy. So? She asked. So I have a daughter, Harlan said, his voice breaking on the last word. I have a daughter, and a wife, and a family, and a home that's actually a home. He looked at Clara. How did I get so lucky? You weren't lucky, Clara said, coming to wrap her arms around both of them. You were kind. You said yes when you could have said no. You opened your door to two strangers when it would have been easier to turn away. That wasn't luck, Harlan. That was choice. As they stood there together, the three of them watching snow fall over the Kansas plains, Harlan thought about that first day. About a little girl's brave question and his surprising answer. About how the smallest moments of kindness could ripple outward into an entire life. How saying yes to helping someone could mean saying yes to hope and healing and love. The barn that had once been just an offer of temporary shelter had become a symbol of something much larger, of human connection, of choosing courage over fear, of building family not through blood, but through commitment and care. And the man who'd spent 6 years convinced he was better off alone had discovered that he'd only been half alive, waiting for two lost souls to show him what living really meant. That winter, Claire discovered she was pregnant. The news brought joy that seemed to expand the walls of their home, making space for this new life they'd created together. Annie was ecstatic at the prospect of becoming a big sister, already planning all the things she'd teach the baby. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" she asked Harlan one evening. "No way to know until the baby arrives." "I hope it's a girl," Annie said thoughtfully. "But if it's a boy, that's okay too. Either way, I'll teach them about the ranch, and the animals, and how to be brave when things are scary." Harlan smiled. "You're going to be a wonderful big sister." "I learned from watching you and Mama," Annie said matter-of-factly. "You show me every day what it means to be family." The baby arrived in early June, a healthy boy they named Thomas William. Thomas for Harlan's brother, William for Clara's late husband. It was Clara's idea, her way of honoring the people who'd shaped them while building something new. "They'd both be happy for us," she said as she held their son for the first time. "They'd want us to remember them, but they'd want us to live too." As summer returned to the Kansas plains, bringing with it the anniversary of that fateful day when Annie had asked her question at the fence, Harlan found himself reflecting on everything that had changed. His house was full of noise and laughter and life. His days were busy with family and work and purpose. His heart, which he'd thought permanently closed, had opened so wide it sometimes scared him with its capacity for love. One evening, he stood at the fence line where it had all begun, the same spot where he'd been working that hot summer day when two desperate strangers had appeared in his life. Clara joined him, Thomas sleeping peacefully in her arms, Annie holding her hand. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked. "About how different everything is," Harlan said. "About how close I came to saying no that day. About how my entire life hinged on a moment of choosing kindness over convenience." "My entire life hinged on Annie's courage," Clara said. "On her ability to ask for help when I was too proud or too afraid." Annie, now 8 years old and wise beyond her years, looked up at them both. "I think both things were important, me asking and you answering, because it takes two people to build a bridge, one to reach out and one to reach back." Harlan scooped Annie up with his free arm, pulling his whole family close. "When did you get so smart?" "I've always been smart," Annie said with the confidence of a child who knew she was loved. "You just finally noticed." They stood there together as the sun set over the plains, painting the sky in colors that seemed too beautiful to be real. Harlan thought about Morrison's words from months ago, that sometimes fear was smart, that it kept you alive. And while that might be true, Harlan had learned something more important, that courage, real courage, wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to live fully despite it. He'd been afraid that day when Annie asked her question, afraid of disrupting his carefully constructed solitude, afraid of letting people close enough to hurt him, afraid of caring again after so much loss. But he'd said yes anyway, and that single yes had changed everything. "Thank you," he said to no one in particular, to everyone at once, "for asking, for answering, for staying, for building this with me." "We're not done building yet," Clara said with a smile. "We have a whole life ahead of us still." No, Harlan agreed, looking at his wife, his daughter, his son, his home, his life. "We're just getting started." And as fireflies began their nightly dance over the fields and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Harlan Gage, who'd once believed himself permanently broken, understood with perfect clarity that sometimes the greatest strength lies in being willing to be vulnerable. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say yes when every instinct tells you to say no. And that sometimes salvation comes not in the form you expect, but in the form you need, if only you're willing to open your door and let it in. The barn stood solid in the gathering darkness, no longer a symbol of temporary shelter, but a reminder of the day everything changed. The day a desperate child asked a question and a lonely man gave the only answer that mattered. The day two broken families found each other and became whole. The day kindness created a home, and home became the place where love finally learned it was safe to stay.